Chapter 415. Pursuit, Fighting and Fleeing. When dawn was about to break, the whole Reki city was in complete chaos. Wulon State was very big. Reki City was outside the halo of the polar sun and the polar night, and there was still a normal alternation of day and night. However, in the time before dawn, the light between heaven and earth was dimmer. Dimness meant vagueness. Vagueness meant chaos. The dazzling light with surging power spread from the north of the city all the way to the center of the city. In the dim environment, a large area of surging and endless light shone out. The battle area was constantly shifting and expanding. The police and the army were all involved. The roaring explosion set off fire, and thunder fell from the sky. The shops, supermarkets, and neatly arranged cars on both sides of the road turned into ruins and wreckage in the majestic power and the explosion of gunpowder. More and more experts joined the chase, and a large number of troops began to block the surrounding roads, forming a human wall one after another. The battle was intermittent. Amidst the raging thunder and fire that filled the sky, there would occasionally be a flash of sword light that tore through all the attacks. Then, more light would descend. The extremely turbulent sword chi and light kept changing directions. Under the leadership of the officers, the army that had sealed off the road built a thick ice wall that almost sealed off all the roads. The space for the illusory but extremely terrifying sword light to move became smaller and smaller. When there was nowhere to go, the sword light could only tear the ice wall that had reached a thickness of tens of meters. The sword light became a little slow when tearing the ice wall. Huge ice cubes flew everywhere, blood stained the ice, and countless corpses fell on the street. Although the looming sword light became more and more difficult, it always existed tenaciously. Under the strong intervention of the Rekvia family, all the military forces, police forces, and expert teams in Reki City were all operating. The absolute advantage in numbers almost overwhelmed everything. Ice walls appeared in every corner of the battlefield, flashing with blue light and flying over, raging every inch of space. Li Tianlan's actions were getting more and more difficult. He had never underestimated the relationship between the Rekvia family and the Jiang family of South America, nor had he doubted the influence of the Rekvia family in Reki City. But he did not expect that the military of Wulon State would have such an excellent response speed. From the north of the city to the center of the city, in less than 20 minutes, the lineup to kill him had become incomparably luxurious. At this moment, Li Tianlan could see that there were nearly 6 thunder-shocking realm experts, 2 half-step invincible realm experts, and 1 invincible realm expert chasing after him. The army of Reki City was trying to restrain him at all costs. Even if they had to sacrifice their lives, they didn't want to give Li Tianlan any chance to breathe. Time passed slowly. The losses of Wulon State were getting greater and greater. Li Tianlan was under more and more pressure. Jiang Qianyan completely let go of all distractions and bit Li Tianlan hard. It was not until this moment that he was finally sure that Li Tianlan might not be the strongest invincible realm expert in the dark world, but he was definitely the most difficult to deal with. Shadow Formula, Desperate Dao Chase, Night Travel. Several of the most outstanding body movements in the dark world were completely integrated into his body. He was swift, unpredictable, and impossible to guard against. Jiang Qianyan had a splitting headache. The speed brought by the dual wind and thunder veins to Li Tianlan was not much worse than that of a real invincible realm expert. Jiang Qianyan had trapped Li Tianlan in a situation of certain death many times. But every time he tore apart Li Tianlan with his power, it was a vivid and indistinguishable shadow. The shadow could not only die for Li Tianlan, but it could also swap places with the real body at will, which increased Li Tianlan's flexibility several times. In this state, Jiang Qianyan could beat Li Tianlan, but he couldn't King hit him. Jiang Qianyan suppressed his inner impetuosity and had no idea of giving up. Night travel was the top assassination skill. Invisible and traceless. The desperate Dao chase was very fast, and it was unparalleled in both pursuit and evasion. The shadow symbol formula was extremely strange and flexible. The dragon fist was all-encompassing. The 24 moves of sword was unparalleled. Li Tianlan wandered between reality and illusion, and the flashing sword intent carried the power to tear the world apart. The dual wind and thunder veins were perfect. Looking at Li Tianlan from a hostile standpoint, Everything he had at this time was enough to make people desperate. Jiang Qianyan was not without a way to restrain Li Tianlan. The problem now was that he did not have that condition. Opportunities were always fleeting. Li Tianlan was so fast that Jiang Qianyan could not make a move. What he needed was distance. Within 30 meters, no matter how many trump cards Li Tianlan had, it was useless. After all, he was not really invincible. The ever-changing 30-meter mortal world could completely imprison Li Tianlan. In the blood and fire that filled the whole battlefield, the battle was in a stalemate. Li Tianlan seemed to be unable to get away. But Jiang Qianyan could not rush to the distance he wanted, either. The whole battlefield kept moving in the city center, smashing several blocks in a row. At some point, the distance between Jiang Qianyan and Li Tianlan seemed to be narrowed for a moment. But before he could make a move, Li Tianlan had already exchanged places with his own shadow. The sky of Reki City gradually lit up. The whole city was in complete chaos. The dense army that surrounded the battlefield, the broken ice wall, the raging thunder and fire, the piles of corpses and blood. Although the municipal government had issued an emergency notice, many pedestrians were still affected. The fire in the city center kept burning, and black smoke rose into the sky. The whole city looked like it had entered a period of war, a scene of doomsday. Orders were issued from Reki City one after another. All the troops around Reki City began to mobilize. At 5:30 in the morning, the Congress of Wulan State officially launched and passed the plan. They were determined to besiege the city. The president of Wulan State personally addressed the world. He said that Reki City was experiencing a disaster, but at the same time, he asked the people to continue to have confidence in their government. At the same time, the foreign minister of Wulan State called Zhongzhou State continuously, asking Zhongzhou State to explain the destruction of Reki City by Li Tianlan, the commander of the Snowdance Corps. The ambassador of Wulan State to the United Nations applied for a meeting, asking Zhongzhou State to give an explanation and make compensation. The deep-rooted dominance of the Rekvia family in Wulan State broke out completely in the shortest time, and turned into a frenzy. The application for a meeting of the United Nations was still being reviewed. But the whole world knew about the disaster of Reki City. The whole world was watching Reki City. At the same time, it was also watching Zhongzhou State and the Snowdance Corps. Everything happened too fast. It was so fast that people couldn't react at all. By the time everyone received the news, the entire situation had completely tilted in an uncontrollable direction. In the face of Wulan State's questioning, in the face of the implicit or tough hints of other major powers, Zhongzhou State could only remain silent for the time being. But the Snowdance Corps was no longer silent. Just when the whole world was ready to condemn Zhongzhou State, in the garrison of Zhongzhou State, an elite army of 5,000 people of the Snowdance Corps left and marched to Wulan State. The whole world was in an uproar. Star State, Snow Country, France, England, Germany, and many other powers in the world called Zhongzhou State and asked Zhongzhou State to exercise restraint. Eastern Europe was in chaos. But if possible, no one wanted a real large-scale war to break out in Eastern Europe. If everything was controlled in the conflict of the Dark World, it would be in the best interest of everyone. But the problem was that now the Snowdance Corps seemed to be completely out of control. Zhongzhou State couldn't contact Li Tianlan at all, not even Chen Qingwan, the vice-marshal of the Snowdance Corps. At 5:50 in the morning, the president of Wulan State's speech to the world had come to an end. The president of Wulan State officially defined Zhongzhou State as a hostile country, and declared that all the members of the Snowdance Corps were terrorists. Any force or country that provided shelter to the Snowdance Corps would become the enemy of Wulan State. Wulan State would fight against the enemy at all costs to maintain the dignity of the motherland. The influence of the Rekvia family had become a giant hand that covered the sky and the sun, stirring up several countries around Wulan State. For a time, 3 countries in Eastern Europe, including Wulan State, defined Zhongzhou State as a hostile country, and the Snowdance Corps as terrorists at the same time. No one could imagine that Zhongzhou State's entry into Eastern Europe would be so intense. Similarly, no one could imagine that Li Tianlan's approach would cause such a huge chain reaction. The Snowdance Corps was out of control. Li Tianlan was also completely out of anyone's control. But the situation was also out of control. The question was whether Li Tianlan could still control the situation? At present, Li Tianlan seemed to have no way back. Beihai Province. Mount Dibing. Wang Tianzong listened to Chen Qinghuan's phone call in silence for a long time. Chen Qinghuan was a direct descendant of Wang Qinglei's faction. However, although the internal dangers of the Wang family of Beihai were serious, he did not understand everything before the contradictions were made public. Wang Qinglei did not object to Chen Qinghuan getting the position of vice marshal of the Snowdance Corps, nor did he give him any hints. In this way, Chen Qinghuan naturally did his duty. What excited him more was Li Tianlan's recklessness. He didn't know Li Tianlan's plan, and he wasn't even sure if the young man had a plan. He got off the plane and went straight to Reki City. Unfortunately, he was not strong enough. Now that such a big mess had happened, Chen Qinghuan almost had the urge to cheer. This was an absolutely good opportunity. Perhaps Li Tianlan could not be defined as treason, but with the development of the situation, Zhongzhou State was under more and more pressure. If the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City joined forces, it was entirely possible to force Zhongzhou State to give up Li Tianlan. At that time, it would be shown that Li Tianlan was a traitor of Zhongzhou State. Not only would the pressure of Zhongzhou State disappear, but as the vice marshal of the Snowdance Corps, for the stability of the Snowdance Corps, Chen Qinghuan would be the best candidate to serve as the commander of the Snowdance Corps. So on the phone, facing Wang Tianzong, whom he usually respected and estranged, Chen Qinghuan's tone had been a little excited. Your Majesty, this is an opportunity. Why don't we join forces with Kunlun City to push it? No hurry. After a long silence, Wang Tianzong slowly said, It's not over yet. Don't rush to conclusions. Wait and see. Chen Qinghuan was stunned. Wang Tianzong silently hung up the phone. However, before the phone was hung up, Wang Tianzong's words shocked Chen Qinghuan. I will arrive in Eastern Europe before tonight. At 6 o'clock in the morning, all the troops of Reki City had been completely assembled. The troops of all the nearby cities were mobilized. Reki City was completely blocked and besieged. Li Tianlan tried his best to move the battlefield, and his actions became more and more difficult. The pursuit continued. Jiang Qianyan was less than 40 meters away from Li Tianlan. The battlefield moved from the north of the city to the city center, nearly 30 kilometers away. The fight that made everyone tremble with fear was about to end. Ahead, in the Holy Thunder Memorial Square of Reki City, for the entire Wulan state, this was a sacred place for heroes. Jiang Qianyan suddenly felt that this square was really good. Although the square was destined to be ruined in this battle, Li Tianlan deserved the honor of this place. Close. More than a dozen monuments tens of meters high on the square looked extremely majestic and solemn in the dawn sky. The morning sun cut through the sky. The morning sun shone from the east. Jiang Qianyan subconsciously narrowed his eyes. His vision blurred for a moment. The next second, Li Tianlan's bloody figure suddenly disappeared in the sunlight. Jiang Qianyan was not in a hurry and just sneered. Now the so-called stealth body movement and optical camouflage were meaningless. Because Eastern Europe was too cold. The square surrounded by tens of thousands of troops was even colder. An ice wall covering the entire square was constantly spreading and taking shape. The ice wall condensed by tens of thousands of people was almost a glacier. It was not easy for Gu Qianchuan, or even the experts at the bottom of the divine list to break through such a scale. No matter how sharply Tianlan's sword energy was, what could he do? The troops began to gather toward the center of the square from all directions. The condensed glacier blocked the sunlight and slowly squeezed over. Jiang Qianyan's figure stepped into the memorial forest of monuments in the square. There were wisps of light coming out of him and sweeping forward. The light completely enveloped Jiang Qianyan. The blood on his body disappeared from everyone's sight. The light completely covered him. Jiang Qianyan moved slowly, like a leisurely walking sun. The light kept surging. 30-meter mortal world, glorious holy hall. In an instant, all the light centered on Jiang Qianyan. It spread out and covered the entire square. In the strongest field of the Jiang family of South America, all optical camouflage was meaningless. Jiang Qianyan saw Li Tianlan. All the experts who followed him also saw Li Tianlan. He stood on the tallest monument in the monument forest, holding a long sword. The sword intent on the blade of falling stars whistled. The moment his figure appeared in the domain, the silver light suddenly rose into the sky. The long sword stabbed straight. The silver light burst out. The sword intent was completely restrained, and it looked very ordinary. But as the sword intent of nothingness passed, everything became extremely real in an instant. The silver sword edge was still moving forward. Li Tianlan took a step forward. The light around him changed from real to nothingness, and from nothingness to falsehood. But the illusory sword intent appeared in everyone's mind with incomparable realism. The sword seemed to pierce the space. The sword light lit up. The sword energy had been overwhelming and surging down. Sea-breaking move. The sword energy enveloped all the experts, including Jiang Qianyan. Blood sputtered. Jiang Qianyan was calm. When the sword energy was about to sweep his body, he was calm and even had the mood to smile. 30-meter mortal world so close, yet worlds apart. The 30-meter mortal world was fast. But this foot-apart art was even faster. The whole space was obviously distorted. Jiang Qianyan's figure retreated like a cannonball. In the blink of an eye, his figure almost disappeared from Li Tianlan's sight. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows sharply, and the blade of falling stars moved forward again. He seemed to want to chase. "Why can't you see me?" A peaceful voice with a vicious smile suddenly sounded behind Li Tianlan. Bang! Jiang Qianyan, who seemed to have retreated far away, appeared directly behind Li Tianlan and punched him hard in the back of the heart. Thick blood spurted out of his mouth. However, this powerful and heavy punch did not send him flying. All the power rushed into his body, broke out, and became a serious injury. It became an internal injury. Jiang Qianyan laughed. Li Tianlan had the shadow formula. He had the desperate chase. He had the dark night walking. They were all the top body techniques in the dark world. But not all the top body techniques in the dark world belonged to the Li family. 30-meter mortal world was the strongest unique skill of the Jiang family of South America. In other words, the Jiang family of South America only had this unique skill. But the endless changes in it were equally broad and profound. The 3-inch world belonged to the body technique. A short distance between worlds also belonged to the body technique. Li Tianlan's body bent down subconsciously. The vast and spreading domain gathered quickly, with crazy killing intent. 30-meter mortal world Sanluo Hell. The domain closed. The sound of wind could be heard from every corner of the domain. Masses of air condensed in the domain one after another, eventually turning into swords and sabers. The swords and sabers were all aimed at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan, in a seriously injured state, took the Sanluo Hell head-on. It was not easy to find a whole body, not to mention whether he could survive or not. Jiang Qianyan punched down again. Li Tianlan's figure disappeared in an instant. A shadow broke in front of Jiang Qianyan. Li Tianlan's figure moved sideways in 2 steps, changed his position, and faced Jiang Qianyan. The distance between the two was no more than 5 meters, and they stood on the same monument. "Go in peace." Jiang Qianyan sneered and clenched his fist. The swords and sabers that filled every corner of the domain shook at the same time, like a large torrent, rushing toward Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan held falling stars with both hands. He raised the sword to his eyebrows. This move was not a unique skill, only sword intent. The purest sword intent surged violently on the blade of falling stars, rushing toward the dense swords and sabers that occupied his field of vision. The swords and sabers perished in the sword intent. However, more and more swords and sabers were rushing over endlessly. The domain of the 30-meter mortal world grew thicker and thicker. It was unbreakable. Li Tianlan's sword intent kept flying in the domain, but it was always a step behind. No skill could make up for this step. This was the gap between the invincible realm on the holy list and the invincible realm. Naked, obvious, close but out of reach. Only a step behind, but the outcome was clear. Li Tianlan's sword intent grew weaker and weaker. In the domain, the mighty swords and sabers turned into a growing torrent, pressing toward Li Tianlan's body. Jiang Qianyan, who was also trying his best to maintain the domain, narrowed his eyes and was about to continue. Boom. The whole monument, which was tens of meters high and nearly 10 meters wide, shook with a bang. A heat wave as violent as magma rose from under his feet, and the flames were monstrous. The army in the distance was still slowly gathering toward the square. But in a few unknown corners of the square, there was sword light and wind and clouds surging. It was like a plan agreed in advance. It was also like a temporary rescue. The sword light surged and burst out. The killing intent that had been lying in ambush here for a long time burst out at Jiang Qianyan's most relaxed moment. Jiang Qianyan lowered his head. At this moment, he finally understood why Li Tianlan rushed in this direction at the risk of aggravating his injury not long ago. He looked over the tall monument and saw a skinny old man who was already a little bald. The old man appeared silently under the monument and held a corner of the monument in his palm. The raging flames surged up like a surging wave. The whole stone monument instantly turned red, and even a little transparent. The old man's arm shook violently. In the boundless heat wave, the whole monument kept shaking. The skinny old man seemed to have pulled the whole monument, which was tens of meters high, out of the ground with one hand, uprooting mountains and rivers. About Chen Qingwan, it seems to have been said that he was a woman. I was going to write that he was a woman at first, but then I thought how bad it was to be a woman. So I did an operation on him. He became a man. It's officially confirmed that Chen Qingwan's operation was successful. He is a man. Genius. 1 second to remember this website. Mobile version. Chapter 416. The change in the square was so sudden. Just when everyone thought that the outcome had been decided and Li Tianlan was bound to die, the whole situation plummeted, and there were infinite variables in an instant. The vast and thick layer of ice still covered the entire square. But on the icy plaza, under the monument, flames suddenly soared into the sky. The monument, which was tens of meters tall, was almost uprooted. Flames burned from the bottom of the solemn and tall stone pillars. The blazing heat dispelled the chill, and a raging fire that was similar to a domain appeared in everyone's sight. The flames roared and jumped, and the heat waves rolled. The layer of ice formed by the tens of thousands of soldiers suddenly stopped, and then continued to press forward. However, its speed gradually slowed down as if it had met with some kind of resistance. The Sanluo hell transformed from the 30-meter mortal world still suppressed Li Tianlan's sword intent. Jiang Qianyan lowered his head and stared at the old man under the monument with bloodshot eyes. As the second master of the Jiang family of South America, Jiang Qianyan could be unfamiliar with anyone, but he would never be unfamiliar with Zhongzhou State. The Jiang family of South America was the only superpower that Zhongzhou State clearly listed as a hostile force. Even the Heroes Club that had invaded Zhongzhou State had never received such an honor. The Jiang family of South America was rooted in South America, like a big tree with branches and leaves, and had long reached the sky. The feud between Zhongzhou State and the Jiang family of South America was almost a war from beginning to end. The Jiang family of South America had always stubbornly believed that Zhongzhou State should have been theirs. After the establishment of Zhongzhou State, the Jiang family lay dormant in Taiwan Island. After the return of Taiwan Island hundreds of years ago, the Jiang family took root in South America. For a long time, this obsession, which they regarded as hatred, had been supporting their development. They were enemies of Zhongzhou State and had caused unimaginable damage to Zhongzhou State. Zhongzhou State had also caused heavy losses to the Jiang family of South America. In the past hundreds of years, the Wang family of Beihai and the Li family of Zhongzhou State were at the height of their power, and the Jiang family of South America was not allowed to enter Zhongzhou State. After the collapse of the Li family and the rise of the Gu family, the Jiang family of South America tentatively set up several strongholds in Zhongzhou State. However, those strongholds were completely destroyed by Qin Weibai before and after the decisive Battle of Heaven Capital 3 years ago. But the Jiang family of South America never gave up their plan to enter Zhongzhou State. So in the eyes of the Jiang family of South America, Zhongzhou State was the biggest enemy. The Jiang family of South America had a deep understanding of the enemy. The Li family, which guarded the stability of a country with the power of a clan, was once one of the most terrifying enemies faced by the Jiang family of South America. Even though the Li family had disappeared for more than 20 years, Jiang Qianyan would never forget some special people in the Li family. Amidst the flames, the old man with the power to uproot mountains and rivers shook the monument. His figure was already in the shadow of the monument. Jiang Qianyan and Li Tianlan shook for a moment at the same time. Jiang Qianyan suddenly raised his head. The moment the domain of the 30-meter mortal world became more condensed, under the monument, the old man's calm and somewhat dull voice slowly rang out. "Waiter, don't you call me uncle when you meet an old friend?" Jiang Qianyan's body staggered. The domain around him relaxed in the blink of an eye. Li Tianlan's sword intent, which was gradually suppressed by the domain, suddenly spread out, trying his best to take the initiative. Jiang Qianyan didn't care. His face instantly flushed red, and even became a distinct purplish-black color. "Fireman!" He gritted his teeth and his hair stood on end. After some time, he let out a ferocious roar. He seemed to have lost his mind as he lifted his leg and stomped on the ground. The tall and majestic monument burst into flames. The great force penetrated the top of the monument, and the whole monument was completely crushed by Jiang Qianyan's foot. Stones flew all over the sky. The 30-meter mortal world temporarily remained high in the sky, suppressing Li Tianlan. Jiang Qianyan, however, seemed to have lost his mind and desperately rushed to Fireman, who suddenly appeared. Fireman had a high seniority in the dark world. Among Li Honghe's sacred guards, Fireman was the youngest one. So when he later went to the Border Control Corps to serve as the vice-marshal to assist Li Guangtu, everyone felt that he had become Li Guangtu's guard again. But the highness he followed was only Li Honghe. In terms of seniority, Li Guangtu had to call him uncle. Jiang Qianyan called Fireman uncle, and the seniority was not wrong. But the other party was Fireman. For Jiang Qianyan, this uncle really contained countless unbearable memories and humiliations. Jiang Qianyan's body fell into the air. His eyes were scarlet and gloomy, full of deep resentment. He would never forget something in his life. More than 2 decades ago, he and his elder brother, Jiang Qiansong, who was not close by blood but was like a brother, broke through to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. At that time, the 2 brothers were full of ambition and were personally responsible for an operation against Zhongzhou State on the Tiannan border of the Jiang family of South America. The 2 took more than 400 elites of the Jiang family of South America and sneaked into a small village on the border of Zhongzhou State from the Tiannan border. But then in less than 8 hours, the sacred guards of the Li family pounced directly. 2 people. Only 2 people. That night, the cruel poison spread through the village in the wind, and thunder burst out all over the sky. Hundreds of elites of the Jiang family of South America died under that man's hand. He and Jiang Qiansong, 2 at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, joined forces, but they were no match for a fire-flaming realm expert. 3 punches. The other party only punched 3 times. The battle was strange, short, and fierce. The poison spread and swirled in the wind. The raging fire was raging in the night sky. Within 3 punches, he and Jiang Qiansong were completely crushed and eventually defeated. That was the Li family at its peak. Just 2 sacred guards, Poison Doctor and Fireman. But they completely destroyed the plan of the Jiang family of South America in the shortest time. What Jiang Qianyan remembered most was not the strength of the Li family, but the insult, even humiliation, that the man codenamed Fireman brought to the 2 brothers after their failure. They just slaughtered a small village of untouchables in Zhongzhou State. What did they do wrong? But that son of a bitch was Fireman. A yen %% and asterisk. Hashtag yen %% and asterisk no grace no dignity. At this moment, Jiang Qianyan seemed to be completely crazy. His face twisted, he opened his mouth, and a stream of cold and hot air poured into his mouth. His voice was distorted and vague, but countless vicious voices, like shrews cursing in the street, suddenly rang through heaven and earth. In just a few seconds, Fireman's closest family members had been cursed. But Fireman had no relatives. He looked up and saw Jiang Qianyan coming down from the sky, getting closer and closer. Then he punched. Suddenly, the silent and somewhat dull Fireman's momentum changed, and became extremely sharp and fierce. The majestic power shattered the surrounding stones in an instant. Fireman's bones kept shaking. The punch hit the air, but it seemed to penetrate the space. The whole space suddenly twisted and broke completely. The broken space was not filled with silence and darkness. The heat wave that filled the world suddenly surged out of the broken space in an instant. Fire. The incomparably condensed fire occupied everyone's sight. The raging fire surged and spread wildly in all directions with Fireman's fist as the center. It seemed to be floating, but it also seemed to be flowing. The fire that filled the world was burning like solid magma. In an instant, the magma completely replaced the world, and the ice that was pressing toward the square. There were burning flames and flowing magma in the sky and on the ground. Wherever the fire passed, the domain, the sword energy, and the void all fluctuated completely in an instant. The world was boiling. The punch was so familiar, but it was completely different. Jiang Qianyan's eyes became dazed in rage, and then awe-inspiring. The punch. Li Tianlan had just used it. Dragon Fist Azure Dragon Cannon. The punch was like the Dragon Fist, but not quite. It was more like Fireman's own fist, his own martial arts. Jiang Qianyan sobered up in anger for a moment. But the punch that shattered the space had already swept over with the raging fire all over the sky. Those who could be the Li family's sacred guards were all strong men. And with the personal guidance of the Li family's highness, the strong were naturally stronger. The Li family's sacred guards had their own characteristics. In those days, Li Honghe either taught them the unique skills of the Li family or standardized their martial arts path according to their own characteristics, spending countless efforts. Only Fireman was the most worry-free. He had his own path, and was not interested in the Li family's 24 moves of sword. He was too lazy to use a sword, so from beginning to end, he just asked Li Honghe for the first 3 punches of the Dragon Fist. The most basic 3 punches. He integrated his martial arts into these 3 punches. So Fireman only knew these 3 punches. In any battle, he used 3 punches, over and over again. The simple ones were often the most flawless. Jiang Qianyan finally realized the horror of Fireman. The man who could suppress him and Jiang Qiansong on his own should have entered the invincible realm, entered the divine list, and entered the top of the divine list. More than 20 years in prison had completely ruined his path to the invincible realm. But even if he was not invincible, in the fire-flaming realm, he was not easy to bully. The fire, like a raging wolf, completely swept Jiang Qianyan. Boom! A terrible explosion suddenly sounded in the sky. The sword intent that tore the space completely lost its restraint. Li Tianlan's figure disappeared in an instant. But the next second, the extremely terrible sword intent had changed from illusory to incomparably real. The sword light was like a dragon. Without any hesitation, it pierced directly into his back. Jiang Qianyan's heart sank completely. He was really excited to see Fireman again, but what he thought more was that Fireman had been in the desert for so many years. At his age, his strength must have regressed at this time. As long as he killed him, he could concentrate on dealing with Li Tianlan. But he underestimated Fireman's strength, and also let Li Tianlan out of trouble. Neither of them had a clear realm. Fireman was in the fire-flaming realm, but he had already transcended it. Li Tianlan had no realm, but the strength of the two was almost the same. When he couldn't attack, he could only let go. A vast domain expanded directly around Jiang Qianyan. There was no wind in the air, but the whole space turned into an irresistible airflow. The space kept pushing outward. 30-meter mortal world, boundless sea and sky. The whole space turned into a hurricane seemed to completely push Fireman and Li Tianlan away. The 2 half-step invincible realm experts of the Rekvia family, Huangxue and Henry, arrived at the scene. Behind them, more experts of Reki City also rushed over. Jiang Qianyan's heart had not completely relaxed. On the square, which was getting smaller and smaller under the pressure of the ice, the sword intent and the wind and clouds surged at the same time. The ice blocked the sun. In the dim space, the majestic sea of sword shadows appeared in every corner of the square without warning. No brewing, no preparation. The moment the sea of sword shadows formed, they suddenly broke out. The sword shadows were like a curtain. The sharp but fleeting sword shadows were completely aimlessly sweeping and raging. Tens of thousands of sword shadows rushed to Huangxue and Henry. They rushed to the experts who were chasing after them. They rushed to the army surrounding the square. They were overwhelming. The power of one sword was almost earth-shattering. This was the momentum of the peak of the invincible realm. Huangxue and Henry changed their faces at the same time. Without thinking about it, they turned around and ran. Jiang Qianyan saw all this clearly. He suddenly opened his mouth. "Come back, it's all fake." Before he could finish speaking, an even louder and clearer voice suddenly swept across the battlefield. Borrowing the sword to yin and yang. Ice and fire intertwined on the battlefield. Ice was yin. Raging fire was yang. Borrowing the sword. There was a clear and crisp sound of a long sword being unsheathed on the battlefield. Fireman let go of his control. The boundless raging fire and ice kept surging and madly condensed above Jiang Qianyan's head. The yin and yang sword intent circulated. In the blink of an eye, two different kinds of light appeared above Jiang Qianyan's head. It was like the sun and the moon shining together. The light was cold and hot. At the same time, the sword curtain, which was comparable to the full blow of the peak of the invincible realm, swept Henry and Huangxue. It swept the tens of thousands of troops in the square. The mighty sword curtain, like a sudden heavy snow, rushed past everyone. Huangxue and Henry, who were in despair, were stunned for a moment. The two superiors of the half-step invincible realm looked at their bodies with some doubts. In the square, the mighty sword curtain had disappeared, and the actual power of the sword, which was comparable to the peak of the invincible realm, was far less than that of the ice-condensing realm. The sword curtain swept all the way, but did not leave even a wound on the two. All the terrifying aura was just an illusion. Or rather, a phantom. Phantom sword intent. Fuck. Henry scolded loudly, and he couldn't tell whether he was glad or angry. The two looked at each other, and were about to step forward. Just when their emotions fluctuated the most. It was the perfect time. Two shadows had already silently appeared behind the two of them. There was no sound, no murderous intent, no thunder. Thunder, raging fire, and cold wind. In a gentle silence, two sharp blades quietly pierced the back of the heads of the two superiors of the half-step invincible realm. The pain went away in an instant. Boundless darkness came. The moment they sank into the eternal darkness, the two superiors of the half-step invincible realm didn't even know what happened. The wind and clouds converged behind the two bodies for a moment, and then silently disappeared into the void. Cool breeze and drifting cloud. Jiang Qianyan, who saw this scene with his own eyes, suddenly blacked out and almost spat out a mouthful of blood. The false phantom sword curtain passed. The real phantom sword appeared directly near Jiang Qianyan the moment the yin-yang sword intent was formed. Li Tianlan, who was pushed out, stood in the distance, where he was. In his sight, there was the sword curtain not long ago and the sun and moon formed by the yin-yang sword intent. The scene was familiar. Just like on Lonely Mountain, Wang Tianzong's magnificent sword curtain and Lin Fengting's sun and moon in the palm. The scenes seemed to be similar, but the artistic conception was far from it. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes, felt the touch in his heart, and clenched the falling stars in his hand. Fireman, who was also pushed out, began to charge. The terrible flame burned him recklessly, and the space was evaporated. Almost in an instant, a pseudo-domain that was only half a line away from the real domain appeared around Fireman. It was only a little bit away from the real domain. Water like magma surged and boiled in the pseudo-domain. The yin-yang sword intent rotated wildly. The sun and moon shone together, and yin and yang merged. The phantom sword intent was no longer a phantom, but combined with the yin-yang sword intent, condensed in one point, and stabbed into the domain around Jiang Qianyan. There was a small breach in the domain. Then it was completely merged with the pseudo-domain around Fireman. Two shocking killing intents came out from different directions. Cool breeze and drifting cloud rushed to Jiang Qianyan from different directions. The threat of death really shrouded him. Jiang Qianyan's expression changed dramatically. Two experts with the combat capability of the invincible realm. Two sword masters of the half-step invincible realm. Two assassins at the peak of the thundershocking realm. The situation suddenly changed. This was a real desperate situation of life and death. 30-meter mortal world, the beginning of all things. Without any reservation, Jiang Qianyan improved his domain regardless of everything, even regardless of the drop in his realm. The beginning of all things was quiet. 30-meter mortal world spread over, resisted the raging fire, blocked the sun and moon, shattered the phantom, and obliterated the killing intent gathered by the wind and clouds. Amidst the silence, a flash of sword light appeared in a place that was both very far and very near. Li Tianlan raised the broken star. The silver sword light was soundless, faint and cold. Everything in the whole world seemed to disappear in an instant. There was no heaven and earth, no things, no mortal world, no raging fire and domain. The world was a sword. What was illusory was an illusion. What was real was the sword intent. Only the sword intent. The sword light tore through the illusion and floated forward in the most real world. There was no speed. Fast and slow completely lost its meaning in the silence. Jiang Qianyan's eyes became extremely frightened. Under the restraint of countless external forces, he could not stop this sword. He really didn't want to die. He had never thought that he would die here. He was the second master of the Jiang family of South America. He was an invincible realm expert. He would rush into the divine list and make the Jiang family of South America more glorious. He would kill Li Tianlan, occupy Qin Weibai, and even take over Zhongzhou state. There were too many things he had not done. How could he die? How could he die? The sword light floated to his chest in the silence. The long sword flashed. Li Tianlan held the sword and stabbed forward. But his figure had completely disappeared. At this moment, the only thing Jiang Qianyan could see was the sword intent that made him doubt the world. Or rather, only the tip of the sword. This was Li Tianlan's kendo. Reality and illusion. Like the heaven-cutting move, the sea-breaking move, and the forever silent world. This move was called shattering. The shattering move tore up the domain around Jiang Qianyan. There was no stagnation or slowness. The sword edge floated forward. Puff! The sharp sword edge instantly pierced Jiang Qianyan's heart. The sword qi completely exploded in his body, mincing his heart, mincing his internal organs, and cutting off all his life force. Jiang Qianyan's frightened eyes dimmed instantly. Because it was dim. So the second master of the Jiang family of South America seemed extremely calm at this time. All the sword intent and domain around him disappeared completely. Jiang Qianyan desperately tried to keep his last trace of vitality. He stood in the air, swaying. Li Tianlan frowned. He was keenly aware that something was wrong and said without hesitation, "Retreat. Retreat." Jiang Qianyan's faint voice sounded, but it was like thunder. The corners of his mouth curled up, and he smiled. His smile was filled with unwillingness and resentment. "I will fall, but all of you will die with me." His voice became smaller and smaller, but in the last glow of his life, his aura suddenly began to swell and climb. Together, Jiang Qianyan's body lit up. In the light, there was his own domain. There was fire, thunder, ice, and hurricane. There were also phantoms, yin and yang, and fireman's pseudo-domain. Everything swelled up in the tiny domain around him. His voice fell. All of Jiang Qianyan's unique skills, as well as the power that had just attacked Jiang Qianyan, burst out completely. This was a full blow from an invincible realm expert on the holy list, knowing that he would die. It was also the final move of the 30-meter mortal world. 30-meter mortal world, live as long as heaven and earth. I live as long as heaven and earth. If I am silent, heaven and earth will be silent. It broke out. The terrifying power burst out in an instant without the slightest preparation. There was no time to react. The surging light, with the final blow of the invincible realm, spread to several high-level members of the Snowdance Corps almost instantly. Yin Qinxi, the Phantom Swordmaster, and Han Chongyang, the Yin and Yang Swordmaster, stood in front. A fierce and majestic force came from behind, pulling the two unprepared people back. The space was slightly blurred. Li Tianlan took a step out. His figure was so natural, so casual. However, amidst the destructive light of heaven and earth, he took a step forward and appeared in front of everyone, blocking everything. Without hesitation. Genius 1 second to remember our website. Mobile version. Chapter 417. This scene was so familiar. It was so familiar that everyone was in a trance. 30-meter secular world air longevity with heaven and earth. This was the final move, but it could no longer be considered a lost art. This was an invincible realm expert releasing all his potential, vitality, all the martial arts he had practiced in this life, and even the power of the enemy's attack on him in the most thorough way. The blow of an invincible realm expert perishing together with the enemy. No one could block this attack. In the desperate situation of life and death, Li Tianlan stood calmly and casually in front of everyone. Calmness was a kind of power. Li Tianlan was so calm, as if he was born to stand there. Whether it was glory, humiliation, or a hopeless situation of certain death, he should stand there. The eyes of Phantom Sword Master Yun Qinshi of Mount Shu sect seemed to have lost all their luster in an instant. She became dull and lost in thought. The strong and real sword intent seemed to have locked down the entire space. The entire space was constantly being pulled back by the sword intent. In a hurry, Han Chongyang inadvertently glanced at Yun Qinshi's expression and sighed softly in his heart. He was the Yin-Yang sword master of Mount Shu. Among the 4 great sword masters, only he was about the same age as Yun Qinshi, so he naturally knew some of Yun Qinshi's past. Back then, when Yun Qinshi's realm was still low and she was traveling in Zhongzhou state, she was once intercepted by the first elder of Azura Path. In a deadly situation, it was a young man she met on the road who solved all of this for her. Finally, it formed an entanglement that might not even be regarded as an ill-fated relationship. Presumably, that year in the northeast of Zhongzhou state, in the same world of ice and snow, there was also a man standing in front of him like today. That man was called Li Guangtu. On this day, it was Li Tianlan who stood in front of her. It was like a joke full of dry humor. Fate, history, the past, all of them were in the cycle of reincarnation. In a sense, perhaps life was just repeating itself. Han Chongyang seemed to have thought of something as well, but he was the first to come to his senses. The confined space kept pulling him back. Han Chongyang raised the yin-yang sword that was already unsheathed. Senior sister. He suddenly let out a low growl. Yun Qinshi looked at Li Tianlan. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud were looking at Li Tianlan. Fireman was also looking at Li Tianlan. All he could see was the back view. The silhouette was not tall or burly, but in the face of the ice, wind, fire, lightning, and the flickering light of the sun and moon, in the chaotic scene, his figure revealed an indescribable firmness and calmness. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud thought of Situt Songyue, the governor of Sai City, who would stand in front of everyone in a critical situation, and of Tribulation, who would inevitably stand with Situt Songyue. Fireman thought of Li Honghe, who always stood at the forefront of the Li family and Zhongzhou state. Everyone had a leader in their hearts. As long as he stood there, no matter what situation he faced, whether it was death or disaster, as long as he was there would be a reassuring force. At this moment, in a critical situation, Li Tianlan appeared in that position and seemed to have the same power. Fireman chuckled. For the first time in decades, he smiled so peacefully, as if he had never experienced decades of imprisonment and countless people's criticism and ridicule. Everything else seemed unimportant. Most importantly, he finally saw the Li family that could stand in front of everyone for the first time. The Li family was very young, but he was fearless. Fireman suddenly let out a long roar. Under the rising sun on the horizon, there seemed to be countless rays of light gathering toward him in an instant. Vaguely, the old man, who was already a little stooped, seemed to straighten his back and restore the calm, silent, and energetic years of his peak. But he was old after all. No matter how unwilling he was and how unconvinced he was also old. Fireman was laughing, but he wanted to cry inside. All those who knew Fireman knew that he not only had the hope to enter the invincible realm, but he had almost absolute certainty that he could enter the invincible realm. 40 years old was a threshold in the invincible realm, but it was not absolute. On the long road of martial arts, there would always be accidents. More than 20 years ago, Fireman was just in his early 40s. His state was very good and even rising. If it hadn't been for the treason case more than 20 years ago, the Li family was still at its peak. Even today, The Li family had 3 experts on the divine list in one family. But how could everything in the world be satisfactory? During his time in the desert prison, every year, Fireman knew that his hope was getting smaller and smaller, until his state began to decline. He realized that he was really old. And this feeling had become so obvious today. At that time, he could crush Jiang Qiansong and Jiang Qianyan on his own. Now the person he crushed was a divine list. One was on the holy list. What about himself? Half-step invincible realm. Some of his unwillingness had gradually faded. When he came out of the prison this time, he was Li Tianlan's bodyguard, a close guard. He was glad that he chose the path in prison. At least he still had a chance to play his part. Fireman's clenched fist trembled slightly. His fingers slowly opened. What even Li Tianlan didn't know was that as soon as Li Tianlan left the desert, Fireman changed his path. He abruptly cut off his road to the invincible realm, which was close at hand but already out of reach. His martial arts path was still there, but he had completely changed his martial arts philosophy. He was the strongest fire-flaming realm expert. In the past few years, as his physical state continued to decline, what he sought was the strongest explosive force. Just like the Wang family of Beihai, a genius who should have been at the top of the divine list, had no hope of reaching the invincible realm in his life. After all his unwillingness and anger gradually turned to peace, Fireman had only the determination and firmness to play his part. Outbreak. Outbreak at all costs. Fireman's fist slowly opened. This simple action seemed to use up all his strength, so that it was extremely difficult for him to open his 5 fingers. The fist turned into a palm. The sun gathered on Fireman. In a flash, the fire as bright as the sun burned all over him. He aimed his outstretched palm at Jiang Qianyan and shook it slightly. There was peace in the air. Suddenly, in front of Jiang Qianyan's bursting domain, a huge and terrifying palm print nearly a kilometer long appeared. The palm print was just a shadow, but it was condensed into a substance by the raging fire. The glacier, which had been torn apart by the aftermath of the fight between several masters, hit the palm print. Large pieces of ice surged and burst. The solid palm print almost covered the sky and the earth, completely enveloping all of Jiang Qianyan's domains. No! Jiang Qianyan, who stood only by his obsession, suddenly roared. Everyone was in action. The phantom sword intent and the yin-yang sword intent surged like a sword river, and the sharp sword energy gathered in the palm print. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud, who were not good at frontal attacks, also broke out with all his strength. Li Tianlan stood in front of everyone, his figure like a sword. He locked the whole space and kept retreating, getting farther and farther away from Jiang Qianyan. Jiang Qianyan's last roar finally fell. The power of the dying counterattack of the invincible realm between heaven and earth exploded directly in the flaming palm print with each finger like a skyscraper. The incredible and violent power completely shattered the space. The fingerprint trembled under the impact of the power, and collapsed completely in an instant. Ice, hurricane, flame, and thunder. Everything became transparent, and turned into the pure power of destruction. Like a tsunami, it rolled into the sky and rushed toward Li Tianlan. Looking forward from Li Tianlan's point of view, the monstrous power rolled up the raging tide, boiling and spreading in the air. As the raging tide passed, the glacier condensed by tens of thousands of troops had completely melted. The sun shone down, but there was no light. All the light was absorbed by that power, and turned into pure cold and darkness. Such momentum was simply earth-shattering. But the surging and majestic outbreak was blocked by the palm print for a moment. The moment was very short. But in a very short time, it was full of vitality. Li Tianlan's confined space kept retreating. His entire person had completely turned into a sword. The sword light was unsheathed, and its sharpness was shocking. The torrent of destruction of the world completely covered Li Tianlan in an instant. Amidst the coldness and silence, there was only a sword light swaying in the air. The sword light was unusually weak, like a candle in the wind, but extremely tenacious, like the most eternal light in the darkness. The world was destroyed, and everything turned to ashes. Only one sword still existed. The confined space no longer retreated. The weak sword light standing in the front completely blocked all the power of destruction. The majestic power washed the sword light, rolled back, and washed again. The sword light swayed and rose in the darkness, and kept going up. The light became smaller and smaller in the darkness, but it became more and more dazzling. In the long, seemingly eternal darkness, the inextinguishable light suddenly became the most awe-inspiring sword energy. The sword energy condensed into a bundle. The silver blade of falling stars was completely carved in a dark void domain. The light was rising, expanding, and finally rising to the highest point. It was like a dazzling star in the darkness. The stars suddenly rotated wildly in the highest place of the darkness. The dark power surged wildly with the rotation of the stars. The whole darkness had been completely shrouded by the sword intent. It was a completely strange sword intent. It was not vast, heavy, or turbulent. There was only coldness and sharpness. There was only tearing. This sword was different from the heaven-cutting move, sea-breaking move, and shattering move. However, this imperfect sword became the most suitable sword to break the stalemate. Sky-splitting move. The dark tide continued to shatter under the rotation of the stars. The destructive power all over the sky was completely transferred to another direction under this sword. In the sudden loud noise, the rotating stars stagnated for a moment. Then the flowing fire suddenly appeared in the darkness, tearing the darkness and silence. The flowing fire and the stars burning in the darkness fell at the same time. Or the darkness was rising. The darkness began to surge wildly. There was a sound between heaven and earth, and a shrill wail came from all directions. The light began to reappear. Vaguely, the people who were blocked by Li Tianlan finally saw the young leader. He was still holding the silver long sword, but his body was completely unbalanced, and he fell from the sky with blood splashing. Cool Breeze's figure flickered and appeared directly beside Li Tianlan. He reached out to catch his body and fell to the ground. The white cloud silk clothes were completely broken again. Li Tianlan, who was covered in blood, held the sword in one hand and crushed a button on the inside of his white clothes with the other hand. Code name of the potion: Natural Healing. It was one of the most advanced gene potions developed by Zhongzhou State. It was extremely rare, but extremely powerful. This was a real life-saving thing. It might not be as good as the immortality potion, which could increase vitality and longevity, but the healing function of natural healing was not much different from that of immortality potion. It was just that the immortality potion increased vitality to heal the body's injuries, so that people could return to their peak state in the shortest time. And it was a complete recovery. But the function of natural healing was to extract the vitality of the injured, and could only temporarily restore the injured to the strongest state. However, this temporary period of time was 3 days. 3 days of peak time was enough for Li Tianlan to do a lot of things. Li Tianlan poured the powder in the button into his mouth and swallowed it with blood. He looked at Jiang Qianyan's position. But Jiang Qianyan had disappeared. In his line of sight, there was only a cloud of dust that was blown away by the wind. The gray dust drifted in the air, and eventually returned to dust. The invincible realm had fallen. Li Tianlan twitched the corner of his mouth, and turned to look at Fireman. The effect of the natural healing began to spread. His body was now perfect, and he had drunk a whole set of immortality potions. His recovery ability was incredibly strong. Under the effect of the natural healing, his spirit began to gradually recover, and his pale face also had some color. "Old man," Li Tianlan called out in a hoarse voice. Fireman, supported by Drifting Cloud, was on the verge of collapse. His physical state was already declining. In the pursuit of full strength, it meant that he would immediately lose all his combat effectiveness after a real blow with all his strength. "I won't die. I'm just temporarily out of strength." Fireman shook his head, his voice reluctant. He leaned on Drifting Cloud and looked elsewhere on the battlefield. The sacred and solemn memorial square in Reki City had become a complete mess. In sight, blood, corpses, and broken ice almost occupied everything. Li Tianlan's fourth sword intent was called Sky Splitting. This sword was not yet perfect, but while tearing the sky apart, this sword also led the power of Jiang Qianyan's dying counterattack to fall in all corners of the square. He couldn't take this sword. The only thing he could do was to lead it. So the final result of this sword was equivalent to Jiang Qianyan's dying power. Li Tianlan's full blow, fireman, cool breeze, drifting cloud, yin and yang phantom, and everyone else's full blow fell on the square. There were troops in every corner of the square, and they were countless experts of Reki City. This blow might not kill everyone, but the ice layer built by the army had completely disappeared. Among the countless corpses, many of the injured were groaning and struggling. As far as the eye could see, the whole square was full of broken corpses and blood, full of wailing, like hell. Hell in the sword. There were few people left standing on the whole battlefield. Li Tianlan watched it all calmly. There was only a kind of coldness and indifference in his eyes that chilled people's hearts. Get out of here right now, Li Tianlan said, heal first. And then? Fireman asked, raising his eyebrows. And then? Li Tianlan glanced around. Jiang Qianyan's final move was called Living with Heaven and Earth. Living with Heaven and Earth. Heaven and Earth were silent. Judging from the result in front of them, the world of Reki City was really going to be silent. Li Tianlan smiled. His smile was peaceful, but with his face covered in blood, he looked indescribably ferocious and crazy. Then go to the Rekvia family, he said calmly. Genius 1 second to remember this site address. Mobile version. Chapter 418. Everything had been planned long ago. The premise of the plan was that everyone had absolute trust in each other's strength. Li Tianlan believed that Cool Breeze, Drifting Cloud, the two sword masters of Mount Shu, and Fireman could destroy all the elites of the Jiang family of South America stationed in Reki City in the shortest time. And they also believed that Li Tianlan had the strength to fight with Jiang Qianyan. Jiang Qianyan had to die. The Jiang family of South America had to withdraw from the game in Eastern Europe in the shortest time with scars. In Zhengzhou State, on the way, and when he was about to reach Eastern Europe, Li Tianlan had been thinking. He had sorted out all the information he could get in Eastern Europe. The conclusion he got was simple. At least during the period when the Snowdance Corps had just entered Eastern Europe, Li Tianlan could be sure that he was safe. He knew how important the information that Qin Weibai used to threaten the Wang family of Beihai was. That information might not be a sharp weapon to sink the economic giant ship of the Wang family of Beihai, but it was enough to put that giant ship in jeopardy. There were a lot of problems pointed out in that information. Every problem could be said to be a secret of the Wang family of Beihai. The Wang family of Beihai would not touch him until those problems were solved. As for Kunlun City, with Gu Xingyan seriously injured, Kunlun City had lost much of its spirit. At least for now, Kunlun City was following the footsteps of the Wang family of Beihai in dealing with the Li family. Li Tianlan was not sure how long it would take for the Wang family of Beihai to solve these problems, but he was sure that Eastern Europe was safe for him in the beginning. Safety meant space. Li Tianlan really needed some space to do something. The Jiang family of South America was one of his main goals, and Jiang Qianyan was the beginning of the whole plan. That was why Cool Breeze, Drifting Cloud, Yin and Yang Phantom, and Fireman ambushed in this square. This was the place they had originally planned. It was located in the center of the city, about the same distance from their respective battle sites. Li Tianlan was a little farther from here, but it was just enough to ensure that when he attracted Jiang Qianyan, others could ambush here. So it became the most likely place to kill Jiang Qianyan. Of course, Jiang Qianyan had the right to choose not to come. But Li Tianlan, who had successfully escaped, also had the ability to rush out of Reki City and sweep all the elites of the Jiang family of South America in Wulan State with several high-level members of the Snowdance Corps. But Li Tianlan was sure of his value. He was sure of his value to the Jiang family of South America, the Wang family of Beihai, and Kunlun City. The beginning of this plan was not complicated. He trusted his companion's abilities. Trust your own worth. Therefore, the entire plan had enough possibilities. Jiang Qianyan's death was bound to shake the whole dark world. Li Tianlan could not grasp the attitude of the Jiang family of South America. But for him, he was here, and the Jiang family of South America had only two choices: either retreat or die. This so-called plan was so abrupt, and there were countless risks and variables behind it, so it seemed extremely reckless. But Li Tianlan knew very well that if there were no accidents, The beginning would be the time when his will was the freest in the entire Eastern European chaos. Only at this time could he truly do what he wanted to do without any scruples. Perhaps all of this was urgent. However, the burden on his back did not allow him to remain silent any longer. So what if he was a little anxious? Every story needs a beginning. If controlling the Snowdance Corps was only the beginning of his ascension to the high-level stage of Zhongzhou state, then the action against the Jiang family of South America in Eastern Europe was the prelude to his sprint to the peak of the Dark World. He had only 3 days. Everything had to be solved in 3 days. In addition to being fast, he had to be fast. Jiang Qianyan's death was silent and earth-shattering. When the news of his death began to spread out of Reki City and Wulan State, Li Tianlan and others who had deliberately lost contact with Zhongzhou State had moved to an old apartment not far from the city center. The natural healing drug was extremely effective. In less than 2 hours, Li Tianlan's internal and external wounds had become completely stable. Li Tianlan, who had returned to his peak state, walked out of the room. Several other rooms in the apartment were still silent. In the battle in the square, Jiang Qianyan's final performance fully explained what the real invincible realm was. The gap between the top of the holy list and the bottom of the divine list had become blurred under the dying counterattack. If Fireman hadn't tried his best to stop it for a moment, and Li Tianlan had resisted it by himself, no matter how powerful the natural healing potion was, it would not have allowed Li Tianlan to recover his ability to move now. That was the style of living with heaven and earth that almost killed everyone. After all, he underestimated Jiang Qianyan. But such underestimation was good and bad. Jiang Qianyan's last move was extremely powerful, but they survived. The move of living with heaven and earth was drawn to the army of Reki City by the sky-splitting style. Under the explosion of infinite power, Reki City lost at least thousands of elites who could immediately join the battle. This was undoubtedly beneficial to their next plan. A balding, ordinary European man sat in the living room of the apartment. His body was straight. When he saw Li Tianlan coming out, he subconsciously stood up, looking extremely cautious and serious. Li Tianlan waved his hand and motioned him to sit down. How did the outside world react? He asked directly. The news of Jiang Qianyan's death has spread. However, we have yet to receive any feedback from the major powers. Everyone is currently focused on another matter. The European man was no longer young. He was in his 50s, but his face had a natural seriousness and caution, making him look a little old-fashioned. He glanced at Li Tianlan. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "Your Highness, you are in trouble now. In other words, your Snowdance Corps has hemp. How annoying. Wulan State and 2 nearby countries have listed Zhongzhou State as a hostile country because of your action. Wulan State announced an hour ago that it had cut off diplomatic relations with Zhongzhou State. Oh, the busiest one is the United Nations. The United Nations is holding a meeting. Most of the powerful countries in our impression are attending this meeting. At present, even Snow Country's attitude is moving closer to Wulan State." He spoke Chinese very fluently. After saying the most important information, he paused. When Li Tianlan had almost digested it, he whispered, "Now the whole world is waiting for Zhongzhou State's explanation." "And Zhongzhou State?" He looked into Li Tianlan's eyes and said, "Waiting for your explanation." Li Tianlan was silent, as if he had never responded to Zhongzhou State, without saying a word. For the time being, he remained silent, and Zhongzhou State could only remain silent. "What's your name?" Li Tianlan asked suddenly. The middle-aged man stood up again, bowed slightly, and whispered, "Gandalf." "Your Highness, my name is Gandalf Guard." Gandalf Guard. About 5 years ago, he entered Wulan State from Germany to do the catering business. His business was neither good nor bad. It was ordinary. His personality and his restaurant were the same as the apartment he owned. On the surface, there was nothing special about them. But in fact, in terms of seniority, Gandalf's seniority in the Samsara Palace was no less than that of some super masters who joined the Samsara Palace later. In the Samsara Palace, he was one of the few people whose name could be remembered by all the high-level officials. The secondary intelligence chief in Eastern Europe. He was responsible for the intelligence collection of several countries in Eastern Europe, with Wulan State as the core. In the unknown but extremely sophisticated comprehensive assessment of the Samsara Palace, Gandalf was also one of the few 5-star intelligence officers. Li Tianlan had little contact with Qin Weibai, but since he became the commander of the Snowdance Corps, he had gradually come into contact with some of the core secrets of the mysterious organization, Samsara Palace. In the case that he temporarily cut off contact with Zhongzhou State, Gandalf's existence was equivalent to his eyes, as well as the source of logistical support and intelligence. Gandalf, Li Tianlan nodded. He repeated, "Well, Gandalf, according to your analysis, where is the bottom line of Zhongzhou State?" Gandalf was silent for a while. "It's impossible to judge at the moment. It depends on the pressure that the major powers put on Zhongzhou State. Wulan State has defined your action as a war between Zhongzhou State and Wulan State. All the major powers now have a reason to intervene. Your Highness, it's not easy for you to be in Zhongzhou State. If you ask me, instead of guessing where Zhongzhou State is, it's better to investigate how much Zhongzhou State trusts you," Gandalf said slowly. Li Tianlan was silent for a long time. They were actually asking the same question. Zhongzhou State could not choose to go to war with the whole world. In the face of the pressure from all countries, when Zhongzhou State could not bear it, it would inevitably abandon Li Tianlan. If Zhongzhou State did not trust him, it might even make this decision earlier. What Li Tianlan had to do was to reverse everything in Wulan State before Zhongzhou State made the decision to abandon him. What he had to reverse was more than his own disadvantage. It was the situation of the entire Wulan State. This was a real upheaval. As expected, Li Tianlan said blandly. But the situation is not necessarily optimistic. Gandalf reminded him. "It's not that bad." A voice suddenly rang out. Fireman, whose aura was still a little weak but stable, walked out of the room and said quietly, "Zhongzhou State can still give us 2 or 3 days. 2 or 3 days. Li Tianlan's peak would only last for these 2 or 3 days. Once the time was over, he would have to recuperate. Such a situation could not be said to be serious or easy. It could only be summed up by Li Tianlan's words just now. It was expected. If this trip to Wulan State was successful, he and the Snowdance Corps would directly establish enough prestige in Zhongzhou State and the Dark World. If they failed, there was no explanation. There was no need for any explanation. It was like a big gamble. It looked thrilling. But Li Tianlan had enough chips in his hand. Li Tianlan silently felt the strange feeling of really standing on the cusp of the storm, and his heart was full of mixed feelings. Enough. He suddenly glanced at Fireman and asked, "Old man, how are you? Can I be worse than you?" Fireman snorted. At that time, he limited his strength to the real limit of the fire-flaming realm, and did not lose to Li Tianlan. Now 3 years later, his state had declined, but his explosive power was more sufficient. Although the old man was old, he was still confident. Li Tianlan chuckled, and his eyes gradually became relaxed and warm. In the desert prison, he had been with Fireman day and night for more than a year. From childhood to adulthood, apart from Li Honghe and the veterans of the Li family, only Fireman had been with him the longest. Confirm Shinker's location. Li Tianlan suddenly glanced at Gandalf and said calmly, "Jiang Qianyan was dead. The patriarch of the Rekvia family, who was supreme in Wulan State, was their next target." Gandalf nodded and began to dial the phone. "Now we have to find more than Gandalf. We have to worry about another person." Fireman suddenly glanced at Li Tianlan and said, "Jiang Qiansong. He and Jiang Qianyan are not biological brothers, but their relationship is better than that of biological brothers. Little Heir died here. He will come here as soon as he gets the news." Fireman paused and suddenly asked, "I heard that there was a black ghost in the Dark World in recent years." Well, Black Ghost is a code name. He is the leader of dozens of tribes in Africa and the guardian deity in the eyes of African locals. Li Tianlan thought of the information he had received and said slowly, "I heard that the Jiang family of South America planned to set up a death training camp in Africa, to compete with the Wang family of Beihai in Africa. At present, they should have achieved something." Fireman muttered to himself. Li Tianlan glanced at him, and seemed to think of something. He laughed and said, "Old man, what hatred do you have with the two brothers of the Jiang family of South America?" There was something wrong with Jiang Qianyan's reaction when he saw you. "I taught them a lesson. His father came to apologize to the Li family. The two brothers called me uncle. Maybe they were not convinced." Fireman said casually. "That's it." Li Tianlan's eyes were suspicious. "It must be more than that." A voice with a strong smile sounded. Han Chongyang, the yin and yang sword master of Mount Shu, came out with a smile. "Elder Fire, is there any gossip you haven't told? When Jiang Heir saw you just now, it was as if he had seen the enemy who killed his father. How could he be like that when he called him uncle?" Fireman groaned. He felt a sense of helplessness that a good man didn't mention his past achievements. At the same time, Reki City International Airport. The flight from South America to Eastern Europe slowly landed. A middle-aged man about 50 years old stepped off the plane with a black man. The middle-aged man's appearance was not outstanding. He had a relatively ordinary face, slightly dark, but his eyes and temperament were extremely calm, even gentle. There was no fierce aura around him. His words and deeds were extremely gentle and casual. On the other hand, the black man standing behind him was like a sharp longsword, surging with a strong murderous aura. In the early morning of August 8 in Eastern Europe, in the absence of any warning circumstances, Jiang Qiansong, patriarch of the Jiang family of South America, cooperated with Black Ghost, the guardian deity of Africa. They arrived in Eastern Europe. Wulan State was a little cold. The airport of Reki City was even colder. Jiang Qiansong walked unhurriedly. He had just gotten off the plane. The news of Jiang Qianyan's death had not reached his ears, so he acted very casually. "Master, who should I kill?" Black Ghost asked in a somewhat stiff Chinese. The Jiang family of South America was rooted in South America, but they insisted on speaking Chinese within the clan. Even all the retainers of the Jiang family of South America needed to master Chinese. "Kill a lot of people." Jiang Qiansong narrowed his eyes and chuckled. "Those who are enemies of the Jiang family of South America deserve to be killed." His voice was calm and gentle. Black Ghost nodded and said stiffly, "They deserve to be killed." When everyone thought that Black Ghost was an ally of the Jiang family of South America from Africa, no one ever thought that the famous Black Ghost was just a slave of the Jiang family of South America. It was impossible for an invincible realm expert to appear out of thin air in the dark world. Any invincible realm expert had cause and effect. If you couldn't see cause and effect, it could only prove that there were things in the world that you couldn't control. The Jiang family of South America set up a secret death training camp in a mountain range in Africa decades ago in the name of a school. For decades, out of tens of thousands of Africans, no more than 10 could come out of the death training camp alive. The number was small. However, every single person who came out of the death training camp was a true expert. But among so many people, there was only one invincible realm expert, Black Ghost, who was poured with countless blood. Jiang Qiansong didn't feel sorry. It was good to have one invincible realm expert among tens of thousands of African pariahs. From the day Black Ghost broke through to the invincible realm, Jiang Qiansong was sure that he would become his most powerful assistant and even partner. So in the decisive Battle of Heaven Capital 3 years ago, after Jiang Qianxia was killed and the murderous weapon, the Legend of Qin, was lost, Jiang Qiansong sent Africa to summon Black Ghost. Black Ghost's strength was not strong. In terms of comprehensive strength, Black Ghost could probably hover in the top 10 of the Holy List. But in terms of attack power, his attack was fierce and could even directly rank at the bottom of the Divine List. His biggest weakness was defense. Jiang Qiansong, on the other hand, was best at defense. Jiang Qiansong now ranked 10th on the Divine List, and he had a code name that was not pleasant to hear. Black Tortoise. Turtles were good at defense. As the patriarch of the Jiang family of South America, although his strength was not high on the Divine List, he was recognized as the best in the world in defense in the Dark World. He and Black Ghost. One for offense and one for defense. Plus Jiang Qianyan. The Jiang family of South America sent 3 invincible realm experts to Eastern Europe this time. And they were invincible realm experts whose shortcomings could make up for each other. Jiang Qiansong walked out of the airport and looked up at the rising sun in Reki City. The light of the morning sun fell on him, so bright and beautiful. Jiang Qiansong suddenly felt that he was standing very high, so high that he could see the whole world. 3 invincible realm experts, countless elites, the foundation behind Eastern Europe, and trustworthy allies. Jiang Qiansong laughed. At this moment, he had no idea why he would fail in this mess. Not at all. He stood quietly at the airport and felt that he was so powerful. It was the feeling of being in control of everything. He stood here and ruled the world. In the shabby apartment in Reki City, Fireman finally couldn't bear the casual questions, but Han Chongyang became more and more serious. Cool breeze and drifting cloud had gradually recovered. Yin Qinshi also walked out of the room. When the Yin and Yang sword master of Mount Shu asked Fireman about his past with the Jiang brothers for the umpteenth time, Fireman finally told the truth of that year. His appearance was ordinary and dull, and when he told the truth, he seemed extremely sincere. At the airport, Jiang Qiansong stood alone and ruled the world. Inside the apartment, Fireman scratched his sparse hair and said helplessly, "It's really nothing. It's just that the 2 brothers said that my urine was delicious." Genius 1 second to remember this site address. Mobile version. Chapter 419. Snow Country Mormons. In the deep polar night light, Flaming Fire walked quickly but steadily into the villa hall, and handed Qin Weibai a copy of the latest information sorted out by the Eastern European Intelligence Department of Samsara Palace. Qin Weibai was playing chess with Lin Fengting. Mormons was a small town that was lively but not very prosperous. However, in the afterglow of the polar night, there was still a lot of entertainment in the city that was enough to make people forget home. Lin Fengting was not interested in these things. When he was not traveling far, he liked to play chess. Qin Weibai catered to his taste. Neither of them had low chess skills, and they were evenly matched. So in the past few days, the 2 had played many games of chess in their spare time. Today they were playing Go. The black and white pieces moved on the chessboard step by step, and the game was exquisite and grand. When Flaming Fire walked in, the game was coming to an end. Qin Weibai did not look up or take the information. She just calmly placed a piece and said softly, "Read it." Flaming Fire paused and lowered her head to open the information. There is still no news about Mellad, the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps. Flaming Fire glanced at the information as quickly as possible and said something that Qin Weibai had been paying close attention to recently. Qin Weibai's delicate and sharp face lines were as calm as water, dreamlike and illusory. The United Nations has officially held a meeting. Star State, France, England, Snow Country, East Island, Japan, Germany. So far, nearly 20 countries have asked Zhongzhou State to explain the actions of the Snowdance Corps in Reki City. Flaming Fire reported calmly. Of course, Wulon State is also included. Be more specific. Qin Weibai raised her eyebrows. Flaming Fire unhurriedly reported the names of nearly 20 countries. From the perspective of the world, this was undoubtedly an extremely luxurious lineup. Not all countries were developed countries, but every participating country was a real power in terms of comprehensive national strength. So many countries targeted Zhongzhou State at a meeting. After the meeting, God knew how much pressure Zhongzhou State's diplomacy and military would bear. What about Zhongzhou State's reaction? Qin Weibai asked. Still silent. Flaming Fire said. Qin Weibai nodded and slowly put down the black chess piece in her hand. The white chess pieces in front of him had almost filled up the entire chessboard, but the black chess pieces were still not at an obvious disadvantage. The black dots on the chessboard were extremely exquisite and strange. In the face of the aggressive white chess pieces, they still seemed to have the majestic power to fight back. Flaming Fire continued to read the information and suddenly said, Jiang Qianyan has been confirmed to have died in Reki City. Reki City is in chaos. Wulon State has passed the siege plan and is currently implementing it. Qin Weibai looked up at her watch. Her bright eyes seemed to reflect time, incomparably dignified and distant. Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost have arrived in Reki City. Qin Weibai finished the last message. Qin Weibai held the chess piece in one hand and froze on the spot. Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost had arrived in Reki City. She was silent for a moment before asking, "Are you sure?" "We're still verifying it. But the credibility is more than 80%. Flaming Fire said. She had been very busy recently. In the Samsara Palace, she was the closest supermaster to Qin Weibai, but she was not responsible for specific things. Most of the time, she was equivalent to Qin Weibai's secretary. Qin Weibai was now the acting patriarch of the Lin clan. Although it would take some time for the heads of the major branches of the Lin clan to arrive at Mormons, Qin Weibai's orders had begun to circulate within the Lin clan. So as a secretary, Flaming Fire received countless materials every day. They came from inside the Lin clan, and from the Samsara Palace. The information was almost endless. Flaming Fire just picked out the most important ones and told Qin Weibai as soon as possible. Qin Weibai still held the chess piece and kept the same action for a long time. Her body was stiff for about 5 minutes before she slowly put the chess piece on the chessboard, but she still did not speak. Flaming Fire waited patiently for a while, and then left the hall in silence. "You don't trust Flaming Fire?" Lin Fengting watched Flaming Fire's back disappear and suddenly asked. "If I can't even trust her, who can I trust?" Qin Weibai smiled lightly. "Sir, you think too much." "Maybe." Lin Fengting smiled. "But I thought you would at least let her know your next plan." Qin Weibai rubbed the jade-like chess piece in her hand, looked up at Lin Fengting and asked, "What's the plan?" Lin Fengting was stunned. He really saw confusion in Qin Weibai's eyes. Lin Fengting found it unbelievable. He recalled the information he had just heard and frowned. Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost went to Reki City. "Don't you want to do something?" "Yes." Qin Weibai lowered her head. "But I can't do anything." Her voice was calm but determined. "Tianlan is in danger." Lin Fengting looked at Qin Weibai and suddenly said in a deep voice. For the future of the Lin clan, he had to protect Qin Weibai. To protect Qin Weibai, he had to protect Li Tianlan. In other words, to protect Li Tianlan, he had to protect Qin Weibai. The two of them were completely connected and could not be separated. The combination of Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost was definitely a superalist combination in the dark world. Lin Fengting had no feelings for the Jiang family of South America. Even if he met them on weekdays, he would not bother to do anything to them. This was not like the Wang family of Beihai. He had no psychological burden at all. At the moment he got the news, Lin Fengting wanted to go to Reki City. With his strength, Jiang Qiansong's so-called best defense in the world was just SOSO. Without the legend of Qin and Black Ghost, Lin Fengting really did not feel any pressure. Considering a certain variable, even if he could not kill Jiang Qiansong in an accident, he could at least make the Jiang family of South America completely withdraw from Eastern Europe, and even completely withdraw from the dark world in at least a few years. Lin Fengting was ready to make a move. Qin Weibai shook her head and said softly, "After all, he has to rely on himself for some things. I can't always be by his side to protect him. He needs to walk his own path. I've already done everything I can do for him. Tianlan already has enough chips. Wulan State is a game he played for the Jiang family of South America. So what if I let him finish it?" Lin Fengting's eyebrows twitched. He knew Li Tianlan's whole plan. In fact, 2 days before departure, Li Tianlan had more chips than everyone expected. The power of Samsara Palace and the power of the Dongqing clan, on the surface and in the dark, were all handed over to Li Tianlan for the chaos in Eastern Europe. Li Tianlan also set his goal in Wulan State with the chips in his hand. The whole plan was simple, huge, and extremely violent. But at the same time, it was very beneficial. Samsara Palace and the Dongqing clan only provided power, but they did not interfere with Li Tianlan's plan. Li Tianlan was in charge of everything. Perhaps when Li Tianlan was unwilling to be dormant, and did not dare to be dormant because of the responsibility he bore, Samsara Palace and the Dongqing clan were also anxious to let Li Tianlan grow up in the fastest time, and take charge. Lin Fengting understood Li Tianlan's ambition. He also understood the expectations of Samsara Palace and the Dongqing clan. But this was not the reason why they chose not to take action when Li Tianlan was in danger at this time. Jiang Qiansong came too fast. In Li Tianlan's plan, Jiang Qiansong arrived in Eastern Europe at least 48 hours earlier than planned. During this period of time, every minute and every second was a variable. I don't doubt Tianlan's ability, but the chaos in Eastern Europe is too big, and Tianlan's starting point is too high. It's good if he succeeds. If he fails, you see the current situation. Lin Fengting looked into Qin Weibai's eyes. Nearly 20 powerful countries put pressure on Zhongzhou State together. No matter how strong Zhongzhou State is, it also has a bottom line. Once they think that the pressure they are under has exceeded the value that Tianlan brings to them at this stage, even if Dongqing Wudi can persist, including the academics, they will declare Tianlan's treason and deprive him of the commander of the Snowdance Corps, so as to get rid of the pressure they are under. Qin Weibai continued. Have you thought about the consequences? Lin Fengting asked. If the Li family bears the charge of treason again. I didn't think about it. Qin Weibai looked down at the chessboard in front of her. Minister Dongqing's persistence is meaningful. In addition, I'm only used to considering the worst consequences. At present, Tianlan has a lot of cards in his hand. No matter how bad the situation in Wulan State is, even if he fails, he can retreat unscathed in the worst case. Then why should I consider other things? Lin Fengting smiled bitterly. Once the plan of Wulan State failed, would Li Tianlan retreat unscathed? Did Qin Weibai really regard the Jiang family of South America, the Wang family of Beihai, and Kunlun City as paper tigers? Once the situation got out of control, maybe Li Tianlan and others could escape Jiang Qiansong's pursuit. But how could the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City let go of this opportunity? With the pressure that countries put on Zhongzhou State, they would try their best to define Li Tianlan as a traitor who violated the position of Zhongzhou State. No reason was needed. The major powers put pressure on Zhongzhou State. The Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City put pressure internally. Zhongzhou State had to give up Li Tianlan. It had no choice. If Li Tianlan failed, he would bear these consequences. How could he return to Zhongzhou State then? If he couldn't go back to Zhongzhou State, retreat unscathed? Tianlan may be able to leave Wulan State alive, but if he fails, the entire Li family. Does the Li family have anything to do with me? Qin Weibai suddenly laughed. She raised her head and looked straight at Lin Fengting with her bright and dreamy eyes, with a kind of sharp but extremely fragile coldness. I remember I told you that I don't like the Li family. I don't like Li Honghe either. I didn't help the Li family. From beginning to end, I was just helping Tianlan and him. It had nothing to do with the Li family. In my opinion, the Li family is a burden that Tianlan carries. It's best to get rid of it. Even if Tianlan is charged with treason this time. As long as Dongqing Wudi insists, he can still control most of the Snowdance Corps. And he doesn't have to bear the restrictions brought to him by the rank of marshal. In this case, he can really make a difference in Eastern Europe. Tianlan has space to move. Why should I consider the Li family? Why should I consider the Li family? Lin Fengting was silent for a long time before he smiled bitterly. So you didn't intend to let Tianlan complete his plan from the beginning. From the beginning, you wanted Tianlan to commit treason, get rid of the shackles of the Li family and the Snowdance Corps, and get more space in Eastern Europe? No. Qin Weibai shook her head. I gave him all the chips that Tianlan could use. I also hope that he can succeed. But even if he fails, he has a way out. That's all I want to say. As long as Tianlan is safe, I won't save the Li family. For me, it doesn't make sense. If you want to talk about the Li family, at this time, the purgatory of heaven capital should have entered Eastern Europe. You should have more common topics to talk about with God about this. Lin Fengting smiled bitterly again. Qin Weibai herself couldn't tell how she felt about the Li family. It was not complete hatred. But she would never have a good impression of him. Such a complicated feeling eventually turned into complete indifference. Talk to the purgatory of heaven capital? There was no need to ask how the purgatory of heaven capital felt about the Li family. But the problem was that from the perspective of the dominator, he only had hatred and resentment for Li Honghe. Lin Fengting's eyes were complicated. His former friend had become so strange now, as if he had become another person. Talk. How to talk. But from the bottom of his heart, Lin Fengting still didn't want the Li family to be completely destroyed. But even if he persuaded Qin Weibai, he could only start from Li Tianlan's perspective. If you stand by and do nothing about the Li family, if Tianlan fails, the Li family will be doomed eternally. Although all this is because of his ambition. If he knows that you have the ability to save the situation and doesn't make a move, he may not have a knot in his heart for you. Have you ever thought about this? I'm right. Qin Weibai's eyes were soft and stubborn. The Li family has nothing to do with me. What about the Lin clan? Lin Fengting suddenly asked. You once said that among all the forces, only the Lin clan deserves your trust. You don't believe in Li Honghe, but you believe in me. Why? Qin Weibai's eyes flickered. Her eyes were crystal clear and bright, with distinct black and white. But at this time there was a touch of extremely complicated light, which seemed to integrate all emotions. Her voice lowered. Because the Lin clan once accepted a disciple. That was why she could trust the Lin clan. Lin Fengting was a little confused. But then he seemed to think of something, as if he suddenly understood a problem. He is your clap. Qin Weibai threw the chess piece on the chessboard. The chess piece hit the center of the chessboard, and the sound was clear like the sound of a sword. I'm tired. Qin Weibai stood up and walked out of the hall. When her figure was about to walk out of the door, she suddenly paused and asked, Sir, do you know which army is the most elite in Zhongzhou State in the past 5 years? It was the army. Not the army. Lin Fengting thought for a moment. Qin Weibai asked about the past 5 years, not now. If we go back in time to 5 years ago, it would be a miracle. The most elite army in Zhongzhou State was undoubtedly the Border Control Corps. It was the same now. But the most elite army in Zhongzhou State was the Thunderbolt Battalion, which was directly under Dongqing Wudi in the Border Control Corps. However, the Thunderbolt Battalion suffered heavy casualties in the war when the 5 superpowers invaded the border more than 3 years ago, and was handed over to the Wang family of Beihai by the Dongqing clan. Finally, the Tiannan Freedom Corps was established. Although the original elites were still there, because of the expansion of the scale, the good and the bad were intermingled. After all, they still lost the demeanor of the strongest army in Zhongzhou State, and even in the world. You mean the Thunderbolt Battalion? Lin Fengting asked. The Border Control Corps, the Thunderbolt Battalion. They were the elites of the elites selected from the army of nearly 5 million in Zhongzhou State. There were a total of 20,000 people in the Thunderbolt Battalion. Although they were not outstanding individually, when they formed a whole, an army of tigers and wolves? That was the real army of gods and devils. Qin Weibai did not answer Lin Fengting's question, but repeated what she had said just now. So Minister Dongqing's insistence is meaningful. If the nearly 2 decades of Zhongzhou State were divided into countless chessboards, for the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City, that game of chess was over after the treason case was settled. For the Dongqing clan, their game of chess had just begun when the treason case was settled. The Dongqing clan had been preparing. Dongqing Wudi and Dongqing Hongguang placed a chess piece more than 3 years ago. He placed his chess piece with a calculated move. This chess piece was now given to Li Tianlan, and he put it on his own chessboard. Who could break the game? Don't worry. Qin Weibai said the last sentence. She moved forward slowly, left the hall, and finally walked into the cold night. Please remember the original domain name of this book. Divine Emperor of 9 Heavens mobile version. Chapter 420. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, all the TV stations, mobile phones, and the internet in Reki City released the same news at the same time. Wulon State officially severed diplomatic relations with Zhongzhou State, listed Zhongzhou State as a hostile country, and declared war on Zhongzhou State. All the people of Zhongzhou State in Wulon State were listed as unwelcome, and had to leave Wulon State within a time limit. The president of Wulon State and the prime minister issued an order in the name of the government that all the citizens of Reki City should not go out. The TV station repeatedly played the bleak picture after the war in Reki City Square. The square, which had an extraordinary significance in the whole of Wulon State, was in a mess. The ice that had been completely torn apart by the sword intent had not completely melted. Blood was spilled everywhere. Countless corpses and injured people lay on the ground, which had not been dealt with yet. The image began to zoom out, and the outline of the entire city gradually appeared on the TV screen. Tall buildings, streets, cars, as well as the surging and endless crowd. All the military and police forces that Wulon State could mobilize began to disperse to every corner of Reki City. The host in the news was telling in a heavy tone about the losses that the terrorists of Zhongzhou State had brought to Reki City. The series of numbers became even more shocking after they were converted into economic losses. The whole world seemed to be denouncing the evil deeds of Zhongzhou State. The high-level meeting of Wulon State was not over yet, but some orders had been transmitted directly from the conference room to the entire Wulon State. The siege plan was officially launched. This was the highest-level military order in Wulon State. The order covered all the armies in about 16 cities around Reki City. In the next 72 hours, nearly 80,000 troops from Wulon State would set off from different cities and eventually surround Reki City. The host promised that he would make Zhongzhou State pay the price. It was said that Wulon State had received reliable news that the culprit of all this still had not left Reki City. Once the personnel of the siege plan were in place, nearly 100,000 troops would surround the entire city. The so-called terrorists of Zhongzhou State would definitely not be able to escape. It was also because a few vicious terrorists were still hiding in Reki City. That was why the government of Wulon State asked the people of Reki City not to go out for the sake of their lives and safety. The TV was on in the shabby apartment. Li Tianlan quietly stared at the picture on the TV. Gandalf used his fastest speed to translate the content of the news sentence by sentence for Li Tianlan. Fireman stood in the corner of the room, silent. Cool breeze and drifting cloud. Han Chongyang and Yun Qinshi sat opposite each other. Everyone had recovered to their peak state and were waiting for the next step. What do you think? Staring at the TV screen, Li Tianlan suddenly asked. Nonsense. The Yin-Yang sword master of Mount Shu, Han Chongyang laughed. His hair was white, and even his eyebrows were white. He was a man who loved to laugh and communicate. It's just a way to create pressure. Breaking off diplomatic relations was true, but declaring war? If they really wanted to declare war, why would they be so high-profile? Wulon State used this tough statement to put more pressure on Zhongzhou State. The declaration of war had already been shouted. Next, there was naturally a question of which side to take. At the United Nations conference, almost all the powers demanded an explanation from Zhongzhou State. But it's just an explanation. Zhongzhou State is silent. Do they dare to bite us? But the declaration of war is different. Wulon State's declaration of war against Zhongzhou State is tantamount to giving the powerful countries a legitimate reason to intervene in this matter. The powerful countries only asked for an explanation before, but now they can basically denounce Zhongzhou State. The pressure on Zhongzhou State will naturally be greater. Wulon State's move is very beautiful. The others did not make a sound. Not making a sound was tantamount to acquiescing to Han Chongyang's view. Li Tianlan's gaze seemed to fall on the army surging and roaring in the TV. But his eyes did not have the slightest focus. The useless heaven and earth drawn by the sky-splitting move caused unprecedented damage to the entire Reki City. A large number of troops, and even a large number of experts were all turned into ashes under that move. Now Reki City was seriously short of power. In other words, if they wanted to leave Reki City now, it would not be difficult for them to rush out. But Li Tianlan had never considered this problem at all. The besieging plan was to besiege their vitality. But in fact, what blocked Li Tianlan and the others was the overwhelming pressure of public opinion in the world today. Things had changed dramatically in just a few hours. Li Tianlan succeeded in killing Jiang Qianyan, which was definitely a victory. But in the current situation, this victory was even more illusory than his sword intent. Li Tianlan had expected this scene. But once the picture he had imagined many times in his mind became a reality, the strong conflict still made him a little uncomfortable. Li Tianlan took a deep breath. Things had come to this. Although they were not facing a desperate situation, they were in a dangerous situation. Under the promotion or direct control of the Rekvia family, Wulan State's attitude was extremely tough. They defined Li Tianlan and the others as terrorists. Now Li Tianlan and the others were probably terrorists in the eyes of all the major powers in the world. Things had come to this point. They would either overturn and forcibly change the existing concept of Wulan State, or they would be helplessly given up by Zhongzhou State, which could gradually not bear the pressure. One step further, and the world would be more open. One step back, and the abyss would be thousands of feet long. Retreat? There was no retreat. There was no way back. So Li Tianlan had never paid attention to the so-called besieging plan at all. Now even if they could leave, they could not clear their identities. Zhongzhou State did not dare to accept them either. At the very beginning, they had a huge and quite risky plan. And now it was just the beginning. Li Tianlan took out his mobile phone and sent a text message. After waiting in silence for only 2 or 3 minutes, there was a quick response from the other end of the phone. Li Tianlan looked up at Gandalf. In his whole plan, several people were the key. Jiang Qianyan was dead, and they had succeeded in this step. Next, if they wanted to reverse the whole situation, relieve the pressure on Zhongzhou State, and even let Zhongzhou State benefit from it, the next key person would become more and more crucial. Sync Rekvia. Gandalf was also looking at his mobile phone. His face was a little ugly, and he didn't even notice Li Tianlan's hint for a while. What's wrong? Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows and asked. Your Highness, I think you should change your plan. A strange look flashed across Gandalf's face. He subconsciously glanced at Fireman in the corner and continued. I have received the exact news that Jiang Qiansong, the patriarch of the Jiang family of South America, has now arrived in Reki City, and with him is Black Ghost. Jiang Qiansong. Black Ghost. Everyone was moved for a moment. 2 invincible realm experts, and they were invincible realm experts who worked together seamlessly. Even if Jiang Qiansong had drunk Fireman's urine when he was young and said it was delicious. But the invincible realm on the divine list was the invincible realm on the divine list. If Fireman didn't go to 9 States prison, he might still have the combat power to crush the 2 brothers of the Jiang family today. But how could there be so many ifs in the world? Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost joined forces. At least for now, their team didn't have the power to compete with them. For the first time, there was an accident in the plan. Li Tianlan frowned and whispered, Why is it so fast? Coincidence. Gandalf said with a wry smile. We don't have high-ranking spies inside the Jiang family of South America, and we can't know their plans. Jiang Qiansong didn't know that Jiang Qianyan had died before he came. His original purpose of appearing here was not to avenge Jiang Qianyan. Of course, it may be different now. He should have known the news of Jiang Qianyan's death. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes and was silent. The situation in Reki City had become more and more lively. The Jiang family of South America, Wulan State, Zhongzhou State, although there were only 3 aspects now, a series of things had happened in just a few hours. How chaotic and lively would the whole Reki City be next? Time ticked by. Li Tianlan took out his mobile phone again. This time, instead of sending a text message, he dialed the number directly. The number was quickly connected. A warm and low voice sounded. Your Highness Li Tianlan? It's me, Li Tianlan said calmly. There's a change of plan. I want to meet you in advance. Because of Jiang Qiansong? The man on the phone asked. Yes. Li Tianlan's tone was brief. He's with Black Ghost. The voice on the phone said. I can't stop him. My people and I will try our best to contain Jiang Qiansong. Black Ghost is yours, Li Tianlan said. The voice on the phone hesitated for a moment. Maybe, he said slowly, we can contact Mr. Lin. Li Tianlan held the phone with a sneer on his face and did not speak. The other end of the phone also fell silent. Well, I'll leave as soon as possible. After a long time, the voice on the phone said slowly. Li Tianlan said, Don't worry. Maybe there will be other forces involved in Reki City after they react. When there are more people, there will always be variables. I don't like a lot of people. The man on the phone gave a wry smile. I'm the opposite of you. Li Tianlan smiled and said, I have a lot of warriors. Real warriors, so I like a lot of people very much. He hung up the phone and found Li Zhonghu's number. The moment the phone was dialed, he hung up again and sent a text message instead. There were only 4 words in the text message, straightforward and powerful. Full speed ahead. Li Tianlan's expression was still calm. After doing all this, he raised his head and glanced at Gandalf, who had been staring down at the phone. Within 2 hours, I want Shankar Rekvia's position. His tone was calm and tough. Such an order could be said to be unreasonable, but it also showed the urgency of the situation. Gandalf nodded with a serious face. I will try my best. Li Tianlan looked at Fireman and hesitated. Say what you want to say. Fireman said calmly. Act separately. Li Tianlan took a deep breath and said, Old man, you take the 2 sword masters to follow Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost. All of Gandalf's forces will fully cooperate with you. When necessary, I hope you can contain them for a while. Fireman and the 2 sword masters. To contain 2 invincible realm experts. This was indeed a very difficult task. Even with the cooperation of Gandalf and the elites of Samsara, this process was not easy. But Fireman nodded crisply and said, Don't worry. Li Tianlan had spent a long time with him. Every time Fireman said he could rest assured, Li Tianlan would be very relieved. He looked at Fireman seriously and said solemnly, Don't force yourself. Keep in touch. Now in the whole Reki city and even the whole Wulan state, only Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost could pose a fatal threat to him. He would deal with Shankar Rekvia. But he had to know the dynamics of Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost. If he met Jiang Qiansong in the process of chasing Shankar, the whole thing would become extremely troublesome. At the critical moment, Li Tianlan needed someone to delay the time. Even 1 minute could change the situation of the battle. Moreover, by mastering the position of Jiang Qiansong's movement, Li Tianlan could also better choose his own pursuit route. With Fireman following Jiang Qiansong, at the critical moment, both sides could take the initiative to create many possibilities. Initiative. In this situation, Li Tianlan only wanted to take the initiative. He accelerated the pace of the whole plan, and also tried his best to grasp the initiative. This task could only be handed over to Fireman. Only he and the 2 sword masters of Mount Shu could barely complete this task. Li Tianlan turned to look at Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud. You go to the headquarters of the Rekvia family. I will let you know when it's time to take action. Li Tianlan said. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud's deterrence in the dark world was far greater than that of an ordinary half-step invincible realm expert. But they were assassins, and they were only at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Such strength could play a role in the battle of the invincible realm, but the risk was too great, especially since their ability was not a frontal attack. At this time, it was most appropriate to put them in the headquarters of the Rekvia family. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud nodded. Fireman Yunqinshi Hanchongyang. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud. The 5 people were divided into 2 groups and left one after another. Prepare a car for me. Li Tianlan lit a cigarette and glanced at Gandalf. It will definitely satisfy you. Gandalf smiled respectfully. He didn't even ask Li Tianlan what he wanted. Shankar's cell phone suddenly vibrated. For a moment, everyone's eyes were focused on Shankar's cell phone. Shankar glanced down. Shankar just entered Senator Joseph's manor. Shankar raised his eyebrows and suddenly said, Let's go. Li Tianlan stood up without hesitation. Shankar put down his cell phone and took Li Tianlan downstairs. The elevator went all the way down and finally entered a hidden underground garage. The garage door slowly rose. A silver-gray off-road vehicle without a logo but 2 times larger than an ordinary off-road vehicle appeared in Li Tianlan's sight. Fierce, tough, cold, and wild. This was the first time Li Tianlan had seen an off-road vehicle that suited his taste so well. Lehrman alloy body, explosion-proof, bulletproof, top-notch collision capability, twin engines, equipped with carbon monoxide acceleration. A maximum speed of 400 km per hour. Can launch 4 hurricane virus missiles, code name Beast. Your Highness, this is the most suitable tool for you. Gandalf said with a smile and handed the car key to Li Tianlan. Very good. Li Tianlan nodded and opened the door to get on the car. The car started, and the roar of the twin engines suddenly sounded. Keep an eye on Shankar and report his position at any time. After saying that, Li Tianlan stepped on the accelerator. The off-road vehicle code-named Beast suddenly roared, and the body, shining with a metallic luster, rushed out of the underground garage and out of the apartment community. The sunlight over Reki City gradually faded. Dark clouds gathered. With the roar of the engine, it began to drizzle all over Reki City. Chapter 421. Reki City, which was raining, was solemn and deserted. Wulon State's announcement to the public was equivalent to officially announcing that Reki City had entered a state of war. The people in Reki City would not choose to go out unless there was a matter of great urgency that concerned people's lives. There were fewer military and police forces that could be mobilized in Reki City. A large number of people were needed to deal with the corpses and the wounded in the ruins of the square. The Flying Bird base, which was responsible for the garrison work near Reki City, was in chaos because of Fireman. Although there were still a lot of people left, their morale was completely low. Jiang Qianyan's move of living with heaven and earth before his death once again tore open the scar of Wulon State's lack of military power. Now in the entire Reki City, there were less than 15,000 people who could be mobilized. 15,000 military and police officers were busy going out of the city to carry out the siege plan. Raindrops fell in the cold and cheerless city. The roar of the engine, like the roar of a beast, resounded through a large block. An off-road vehicle, nearly 6 meters long and 3 meters high, rushed into the streets of downtown Reki City at a speed that was almost out of control. The engine kept roaring. The off-road vehicle, shining with a cold color, was like a metal monster, rampaging unscrupulously in the cold city center. Li Tianlan held the steering wheel in his hand and felt the surging power from the whole car. His eyes were focused and indifferent. Wulon State's choice. Rekvia's attitude. Jiang Qiansong's early arrival. The turbulence at the United Nations meeting. Zhengzhou State was silent for a while. All of this made him feel great pressure. Although all of this was expected. But expectation and reality were two different things. At this point, it was no longer a grudge between the Snowdance Corps and the Jiang family of South America, but a war between Zhengzhou State and Wulon State. Shankar, the patriarch of the Rekvia family, played a key role in it. Li Tianlan really couldn't understand how close the cooperation between the Rekvia family and the Jiang family of South America was, so that the Rekvia family could so desperately manipulate Wulon State and several surrounding countries to declare war on Zhengzhou State. What Li Tianlan had to do was not how to win. In terms of winning or losing, the Snowdance Corps' raid on the Jiang family of South America was already a victory. But this so-called merit was no longer the reason for them to return to the site of Zhengzhou State. He had to reverse the situation in the entire Wulon State. Only by eliminating the pressure encountered by Zhengzhou State could he continue to be the legitimate commander of the Snowdance Corps. Zinc Rekvia was manipulating the will of Wulon State. That was why Zinc had to die. Li Tianlan had no way out. He had enough chips in this game, and even put himself as a chip in this game. When the situation evolved to the present level, he and Rekvia, known as one of the 4 major families in Eastern Europe, had completely become an irreconcilable relationship. The rain grew heavier and heavier. Raindrops the size of beans smashed against the car window. The huge jeep turned a corner with a roar. In his line of sight, a group of military police who were heading to the outskirts of the city had just finished assembling. In the heavy rain, all the eyes of the military police fell on the off-road vehicle. The officer in the front row reached out and made a gesture, shouting something. It seemed that he was asking Li Tianlan to stop. The off-road vehicle did not slow down at all. In the state of war, the officers of Wulon State raised the rifles in their hands almost without hesitation. Bang! Boom! Gunshots rang out. A louder crash sounded at the same time. The bullets did not leave any trace on the off-road vehicle, but the huge off-road vehicle rushed up like a mad bull. The officer who fired the shot was directly knocked out. The off-road vehicle rose into the air for a moment, crushed the car on the ground, and continued to move forward with a roar. The surrounding military police fled in all directions, But there were still military police who had no time to turn around and were crushed under the wheels. In the screams, the muzzle of the armored vehicle at the front began to turn. Li Tianlan ignored it and rushed over directly. A tremendous and muffled sound of impact suddenly erupted. The off-road vehicle's alloy front deformed slightly, while the armored vehicle directly flipped to the side. The muzzle that hadn't turned around seemed to have made a mistake, and a burning artillery shell flew into the sky, smashing into a nearby office building and igniting into flames. Li Tianlan glanced at the electronic map on the car screen. Counselor Joseph's manor was in the east of Reki City, about 15 kilometers away from here. In the chaos, the off-road vehicle accelerated again and roared away. In different corners of the city, all the military and police who were still gathering and had not set off for the outside of the city received the news at the same time. For a time, harsh sirens sounded in every corner of the city. Countless military and police officers of Wulan State began to chase and intercept Li Tianlan. The heavy rain gradually became an extremely rare rainstorm in Reki City. The heavy rain poured down from the sky. In Reki City, where visibility was getting lower and lower, all the military and police officers who had not set off in time all moved and rushed toward Li Tianlan. The off-road vehicle moved forward at high speed in the city. Dense sirens began to sound from all directions. Li Tianlan's attention was unprecedentedly focused. In the silent world, the sudden noise made people upset. At the moment when their willpower was loosened, an almost silent roar suddenly shrouded the sky. The roar was like a sharp blade piercing the air, a little dull and a little weak. But in Li Tianlan's ears it was like thunder. Li Tianlan's fingers pressed the red button in the off-road vehicle completely subconsciously. The entire off-road vehicle seemed to pause for a moment. In an instant, an incomparably huge propulsion force came from every corner of the vehicle. The violent propulsion force almost completely pushed the entire off-road vehicle out. The speed soared, and the vehicle lost control. In the heavy rain, the off-road vehicle almost burst out at more than 500 kilometers per hour in just a few seconds. Rushing forward. Li Tianlan casually glanced at the rearview mirror. There was a long tail flame in the rearview mirror. The tail flame was burning the sky. The rain in the sky was evaporated. The missile fell where the off-road vehicle had rushed through. The earth-shattering explosion and collapse shook everything in sight. Fire and gravel shot out at the same time. Li Tianlan looked back and felt that the car had become a little bad. He pursed his lips. The twin engines of the off-road vehicle also meant that there were two opportunities for carbon monoxide acceleration. Such an opportunity had just been used once. At this time, it meant that only one engine could operate normally. Such a condition also meant that if the situation just now happened, Li Tianlan would have to abandon the car. At Li Tianlan's level of strength, he was actually not afraid of short and medium-range small missiles. But not afraid of power did not mean that he was not afraid of trouble. Especially in the current situation, Li Tianlan needed to use everything he could to save his strength. This was also the reason why he still chose to drive even though he could sprint faster than driving. Because he did not know what was waiting for him ahead. In a long battle where it was difficult to get supplies, every bit of strength meant safety and survival. The missile shattered the air, and the sound of passing through the air rang out again. Li Tianlan jerked the steering wheel. The tires rubbed against the ground harshly, and the huge car moved horizontally for a distance of 5 or 6 meters at an almost tilted angle. The missile fell to the ground, and the huge impact and explosion made Li Tianlan feel a little sweet in his throat. The next second, the off-road vehicle rushed out of the fire of the explosion. Dense military and police began to appear in sight. Armored vehicles, police cars, and military motorcycles. Without any nonsense, the moment the off-road vehicle rushed out of the explosion range, the roar of guns directly suppressed the sound of pouring rain, and dense bullets rushed over like raindrops. Da-da-da. The crazy strafing of heavy machine guns sounded, and dense cracks gradually appeared on the windshield of the off-road vehicle codenamed Beast, but the car was still like a mad bull. It rushed forward and swung its tail. Under the seemingly endless firepower blockade, the off-road vehicle suddenly swerved, the ferocious impact sending the closest military policeman flying. The off-road vehicle that changed directions directly smashed into a shop on the side of the road. Countless chaotic sounds of being crushed and crushed sounded in an instant. And then the roar of the engine sounded again. The off-road vehicle already smashed through the wall on the other side of the shop, rushing towards another street. Someone in Wulon State finally confirmed Li Tianlan's purpose. Combined with Li Tianlan's direction and Shenker's current whereabouts, it was really not difficult to guess the purpose. However, Counselor Joseph's manor was originally outside the city, and it had almost become an important node in the siege plan. Did Li Tianlan, the madman of Zhongzhou State, really dare to kill there? Countless military and police officers were subconsciously a little hesitant. But Li Tianlan was really unwavering. The off-road vehicle, whose body had begun to deform, rushed back to the main street out of the city, moving in the opposite direction. A large number of police cars rushed over with dazzling lights. The off-road vehicle, whose body had already been deformed, charged forward without a care. The screeching of the brakes, the sound of gunshots and screams rang out incessantly. The off-road vehicle rushed out of the city center, leaving behind a pool of blood in the midst of the ruckus. It charged directly toward the east side of the city, east of Reki City. In the luxurious manor villa, Shenker, who had received the news, was a little restless. He not only got the news that Li Tianlan was coming to the east of the city, but also got the news that Jiang Qianyan had died. Rekvia was in Eastern Europe. The Jiang family of South America was in South America. But in fact, the two families had cooperated for many years, and the relationship between the two sides had been very close. When the Polar Ground Alliance existed, Rekvia, as one of the four pillars of the Polar Ground Alliance, naturally had the courage to make waves in Eastern Europe. At that time, even Tyrant, the leader of the Polar Ground Alliance, had to listen to him because he needed the support of the Rekvia family. Because of this, Rekvia was famous for its insidiousness and ruthlessness in the dark world. Not only Rekvia, but countless powerful families in Eastern Europe acted recklessly at the peak of the Polar Ground Alliance. It might be a little short-sighted, but when the Polar Ground Alliance could support everything, the huge benefits were enough to make everyone give up reason. Because of this, when the Polar Ground Alliance collapsed, the first to be anxious was not the major dark forces who were eager to come to Eastern Europe to fish for benefits, but the powerful families who had once formed the Polar Ground Alliance. The Rekvia family immediately sent an invitation to their closest partner, the Jiang family of South America. The prospects expected by both sides were extremely good. But who could have thought that Jiang Qianyan was dead before the chaos began, and the beauty was seen? Shenker was a little confused. If the cooperation between the two families was equal before, then with the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, the balance between the Rekvia family, which had lost its strong support, and the Jiang family of South America had been quietly broken. Such a situation did not seem obvious for the time being, but Jiang Qianyan's death was the fuse of everything. He didn't know if Jiang Qiansong would blame Jiang Qianyan's death on him. Once Jiang Qiansong vented his anger on him, the best result would probably be that the two families revised the cooperation plan, and Rekvia would have to give up most of the benefits. This was the best result, but Shenker could not accept it. What made him even more helpless was that without the Polar Ground Alliance, although he still held a considerable part of the Polar Ground Alliance's power, they could not form a whole, and they were unable to resist the toughness of the Jiang family of South America. What made him even more uneasy was that Jiang Qiansong had arrived in Reki City for nearly 2 hours, but until now Jiang Qiansong had never taken the initiative to contact him. Shenker was absent-mindedly thinking about all sorts of things. All of his bodyguards were gathered in the hall, passing one message after another to his ears. Li Tianlan left the city center. Li Tianlan entered the east of the city. Li Tianlan was less than 9 kilometers away from the manor. 5 kilometers. 3 kilometers. 1 kilometer. Smack. Under increasing mental pressure, Shenker suddenly jumped up and slapped a bodyguard beside him hard in the face. Isn't it annoying? Isn't it annoying? Isn't it annoying? He roared angrily with a twisted face and tore his tie with force. His whole person carried a kind of undisguised irritation. The bodyguard covered his face and retreated. Shenker looked out of the bright French windows. This manor was in an excellent location and convenient transportation. It was one of the most important nodes in the siege plan. Schenker came here to persuade Senator Joseph to station a large number of troops here. At this time, nearly 3,000 people had been stationed in the manor. But Schenker did not feel safe at all. He only remembered the news reported to him by the bodyguard. The young man who killed Jiang Qianyan was less than a kilometer away from him. Prepare the helicopter. Schenker suddenly gritted his teeth. Let's go back to the headquarters. He glanced at his phone again. There was still no call or text message from Jiang Qiansong on the phone. Schenker's eyes were a little cold. Jiang Qiansong would know that Jiang Qianyan was dead. He would also know that he was being chased by Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan had not contacted him until now. Obviously, he was waiting for him to contact him. Schenker slammed the phone to the ground. Contact Jiang Qiansong on his own initiative? He could take the initiative to explain Jiang Qianyan's death, but Jiang Qiansong was obviously waiting for the Rekvia family to ask for help. And any help had a price. A huge price. Schenker would not ask for help. He would rather go back to his family headquarters and drag Li Tianlan. If the Rekvia family was destroyed, the Jiang family of South America would also suffer a heavy loss. Even if Jiang Qiansong did not take the initiative, Wulan State was not weak. Once the armies of several nearby cities entered Reki City, the headquarters of the Rekvia family would also have a chance of survival. A bodyguard took out his mobile phone and began to arrange the helicopter. Schenker kept pacing, and every second seemed like a year. There was a sound of chaos in the distance. The intense sound of gunfire kept ringing, getting closer and closer. Countless military and police officers began to gather in the manor. The extremely messy footsteps combined with the chaotic sound behind made people more and more irritated. Schenker stared at the manor in his sight. An ice wall began to condense at the gate of the manor. The thin and faint blue arc of light kept flashing on the ice wall. The military and police of Reki City rushed over one after another. The fire burned the sky outside the manor. In the increasingly clear roar of the engine, countless flames and thunder spread out on the tall ice wall at the gate at the same time. A silver sword light silently appeared in the sky above the manor. The sword light appeared so abruptly in the world. It was hard to tell whether it was real or illusory. At the moment when countless flames and thunder spread out, the silver sword light began to expand and turned into a light curtain. The light curtain surged in the gloomy and rainy sky, and suddenly fell down like a silver waterfall. The sword intent suppressed the raging fire, destroyed the thunder, and hit the ice wall at the gate mightily. Far away, in Schenker's sight, a white figure appeared in the air above the gate of the manor. The white was very weak, because the white clothes had been completely broken and mixed with the blood. But the moment he appeared, it seemed that only his figure was left over the entire manor. His figure was like a sword, and its sharpness was shocking. The silver sword light, which was like a waterfall, became more and more turbulent. A large area of the ice wall began to crumble. We have more than 3,000 people. Schenker muttered to himself, then suddenly turned his head and roared. Where are the helicopters? Are they here? Hurry up, hurry up. Kill. Outside the manor, a roar like a muffled thunder suddenly sounded. In Reki City, a thunder-shocking realm expert with the rank of Brigadier General shone with blue lightning all over his body. The lightning covered his whole body. From a distance, he looked like a human-shaped lightning bolt. His figure rushed up into the sky and crashed straight into the silver sword light that was like a waterfall in the air, as well as the white figure on the sword light. The space suddenly twisted for a moment. The next moment, the crumbling ice wall that sealed the manor suddenly exploded, and large pieces of ice turned into terrifying sharp icicles. There seemed to be an ice explosion over the entire manor. In the overwhelming ice explosion, flames and thunder danced at the same time, strangling everything. The silver waterfall was directly shattered under the terrifying blow condensed by thousands of people. The silver light all over the sky broke and turned into terrifying thunder. The messy light and shadow completely swallowed the white figure on the waterfall. Beautiful! Schenker suddenly screamed. He was an ordinary person who didn't know martial arts, but ordinary people also knew the strength limits of the dark world. It was not difficult for an invincible realm expert to kill 3,000 soldiers. But if the attack condensed by 3,000 soldiers broke out with all their strength, it was really not easy for an ordinary invincible realm expert to survive. Shankar laughed out loud. He waved his hand and ordered several thunder-shocking realm bodyguards who followed him. "Two of you go and see if he's dead. If he's not dead, kill him for me. Go now. I want to take his head and give it to Jiang Qiansong in person." There was silence behind him. Shankar suddenly realized that something was wrong and quickly turned around. There was no sound in the hall. His bodyguards still stood where they were, but they didn't dare to move. Everyone's eyes were fixed in one direction. Where everyone's eyes met, a young man in broken white clothes stood there looking at Shankar. Shankar's body shook violently, and his heart sank to the bottom. "How about I take your head and give it to Jiang Qiansong?" Li Tianlan, who appeared in the hall silently, blinked and asked with a chuckle. The corner of Shankar's mouth trembled, and he couldn't say a word for a while. The ice explosion outside was still going on. Flames and thunder were shuttling back and forth. No one could see the shadow that was swallowed by the ice explosion, or whether the sword intent still existed. But everything didn't matter. What mattered was that the real Li Tianlan had appeared in the hall, in front of Patriarch Shankar. Death came. Genius 1 second to remember this website. Mobile version. Chapter 422. The air suddenly became extremely quiet. Shankar looked at Li Tianlan, who didn't know how he appeared here. Li Tianlan was looking at him. "How about I take your head and give it to Jiang Qiansong?" Li Tianlan asked in a calm voice with a hint of a smile. Shankar couldn't answer this question. The thick shadow of death, like the deepest darkness, slowly spread and penetrated into people's pores. It was so oppressive that people couldn't breathe or move. Shankar never thought that Li Tianlan would appear here so easily. A shadow deceived everyone's attention, and the real body appeared where it should be most. In this state, Li Tianlan was definitely the most terrifying assassin and killer. Shankar suddenly thought of a proverb in Zhongzhou state. Close at hand, the people were all enemies. He was the patriarch of the Rekvia family. Rekvia was one of the 4 supergiants in Eastern Europe. In just a few hours, his words could affect the national policies of several nearby countries centered on Wulan State. Wulan State declared war on Zhongzhou State with great intensity. Ross State and Oga State around Wulan State announced at the same time that Zhongzhou State was a hostile country. All of this was because of the orders of Shankar and the Rekvia family. If necessary, Shankar could continue to put down chips and let the other 2 countries near Wulan State declare themselves as enemies of Zhongzhou State. He had absolute power, top wealth, and peak status. He was powerful in Eastern Europe, and could do many things that invincible realm experts on the divine list, and even peak invincible realm experts couldn't do. This was the amazing charm of wealth and power. But all of this was meaningless in front of Li Tianlan, because Li Tianlan was too close to him. At this distance, the absolute force was even more terrifying than the power of a country. This was the power that could really bring him a fatal threat. You. Shankar forced himself to calm down, pointed at Li Tianlan, and tried to organize his words. Opposite him, Li Tianlan tilted his head and continued to laugh. "Shankar." He opened his mouth slowly and said in a light and casual tone, "I'm here to kill you. Why don't you run?" Run. Shankar was at a loss for a moment. While he was still in a daze, a deep blue light suddenly exploded in the hall. The raging thunderbolts fell wildly, and the whole space became distorted in the spread of the thunderbolts. The wild thunderbolts completely enveloped Li Tianlan in an instant. The roar of a helicopter's rotors could be heard outside the window. Further away, the densely packed sounds of explosions were still reverberating through the air outside the manor's gates. In the chaos, Shankar's figure was pulled out of the hall, and someone was vaguely shouting in his ear to protect Mr. Shankar. Boom! The lightning wreaking havoc in the hall shattered everything it touched. The moment the thunderbolts converged toward the target, Li Tianlan clenched his fist and smashed it. The lightning was still surging, but all the space around Li Tianlan was directly shattered by this punch. The shattered space spread in all directions, and the blue lightning was wrapped in the distorted and transparent space and swept back. The entire villa was on the verge of collapse in the violent power, and finally, with a loud bang, it completely collapsed. Sink's mind was blank. He was carried out of the villa by the bodyguards and rushed to the helicopter that had begun to descend, but his eyes were always fixed in the direction of the villa. In the smoke and dust all over the sky, the two bodyguards, who had risked their lives to exchange for a few seconds for him, never came out again. Only the young figure in broken white clothes walked out of the smoke unhurriedly. Then Shankar saw Li Tianlan walking unhurriedly in the direction of his escape. He just walked. He just walked unhurriedly. There was no wonderful body movement that seemed slow but was actually fast. Time ticked by as he walked. His pace was so slow that it was almost a little leisurely. The distance between the two sides began to widen. Li Tianlan watched quietly. His pace did not stop. But he did not speed up. In some absurd feelings, Shankar clearly heard the sound of the helicopter landing on the ground. He suddenly realized a problem, and began to struggle like a madman. When Li Tianlan rushed in, he did mobilize the helicopter of Wulon State. But it had only been a few minutes since he issued the order. How could the helicopter come so fast? Put me down, you. Be quiet, Mr. Shankar. Look carefully. This is my helicopter. A hoarse voice rang out. Come on, this thing can ensure our safety. The bodyguards carried the struggling Shankar into the cabin. Shankar slowed down and finally saw an old man sitting in the cabin. He was the owner of this manor, another big shot of Wulon State, MP Joseph. The old man was obviously more decisive than Shankar. After knowing that Li Tianlan was approaching here, he had mobilized the helicopter in advance and began to prepare the evacuation plan. Shankar took a few deep breaths and subconsciously looked out of the window. Li Tianlan outside the window had become a small white dot, but his figure was still moving forward. Vaguely, Shankar seemed to feel that Li Tianlan was moving a little faster. Take off! My God, hurry up! Take off, get out of here. Shankar suddenly stood up, waved his arms and roared the order. The helicopter began to slowly take off, and the roar of the rotors became faster and faster. Shankar's altitude was also rising. He still stared at Li Tianlan through the cabin. Li Tianlan was getting smaller and smaller in his sight. The tension in Shankar's heart gradually eased, and he suddenly felt a little funny. At this moment, he really felt that Li Tianlan, the young highness of Zhongzhou State, was a fool. He once stood so close to him, and he could kill him with a wave of his hand. As a result, perhaps for the so-called demeanor, or perhaps for something else, the other party actually wanted him to escape. Did he really think that he was going to win? Did he really think that he was going to die? Shankar laughed. The young highness below was a fool, but Shankar was still very grateful to him because Li Tianlan's stupidity saved his life. Perhaps the entire Rekvia family should thank him. Shankar looked out of the window, and as soon as he laughed, it suddenly became stagnant. As the helicopter continued to rise, the small white dot below seemed to become clear all of a sudden. Sprint! On the large flat lawn of the manor, Li Tianlan's unhurried footsteps suddenly accelerated in an instant. The helicopter was still rising. Li Tianlan caught up at full speed. The speed given to him by the dual wind and thunder veins had almost exceeded the scope of ordinary people's understanding. With his charge, the whole world seemed to collapse and oppress. It was a kind of terrifying impact that was enough to make people's souls leave their bodies. At this moment, Li Tianlan was like a beast pouncing on its prey in the grassland forest. Like a lion or a tiger. Quick! Quick! Before Shankar's sharp voice fell, the white dot in the distance in his sight had become clear again. Shankar's pupils contracted completely and condensed together. Almost at the same time, Li Tianlan's figure slammed on the ground, and the whole person rose up from the ground in an instant, like an arrow leaving the bow. The white figure and the helicopter were getting closer and closer. Li Tianlan's figure was extremely stretched in the air. Like an eagle. The eagle soared in the sky. Before the incredible exclamation in the cabin fell, the whole helicopter had begun to shake wildly in the air. A huge and abundant unimaginable force seemed to be pulling the helicopter down. A sword intent condensed from nothingness appeared in the air. The sword intent reversed. It rotated and covered the rotor. Bang, bang, bang. In the dull sound, the helicopter's rapidly rotating rotor was completely smashed by the sword intent, and the huge fuselage fell directly to the ground in an unbalance. The broken rotor flew far in the air, and the helicopter, with its engine still roaring, smashed directly to the ground. A large amount of black smoke and sparks rose from the wreckage of the helicopter, turned into fire, and then completely exploded. Li Tianlan's whole person was like an illusion, and the airflow and flames brought by the explosion passed by him. Li Tianlan moved forward silently. The bodyguards of Shankar and Joseph had jumped off the helicopter with them before it crashed, and they were still desperately running. They seemed to want to rush in the direction of the 3,000 soldiers outside the gate of the manor, but Li Tianlan was in the way, so everyone could only run forward. A large number of soldiers in the distance began to realize what had happened, and a large-scale mobilization of soldiers pressed toward Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan's speed gradually accelerated. The figure of Joseph began to become clear in his sight. Li Tianlan didn't even bother to look at him. But Joseph, who was running desperately, suddenly stopped, turned around and glared at Li Tianlan. "Enough, I'm Joseph," he spoke in an impassioned voice. Li Tianlan had already rushed past him. Li Tianlan and the sword light swept past the old counselor at the same time. Both Joseph and his bodyguards lost their voices completely. Two heads with their eyes wide open flew into the air along with blood. Before his consciousness completely dissipated, the old counselor heard Li Tianlan's voice. "Where are we?" he asked in a calm tone. Bang! In a subtle but dull sound, the head sprayed blood and fell on the grass. Fireman's voice sounded on the other side of the communicator. "It's about 10 kilometers away from you." Fireman and the two sword masters were following Jiang Qiansong. They were still 10 kilometers away from Li Tianlan, which meant that Jiang Qiansong was still 10 kilometers away from Li Tianlan. "Cool breeze and drifting cloud?" Li Tianlan asked again. "We have arrived at the headquarters of the Rekvia family, and will solve everything in half an hour." Cool Breeze's voice sounded in the communicator. Li Tianlan looked up at Shankar, who was running farther and farther away. He took out his mobile phone, sent a text message, and confirmed the meeting place with the ally he had not yet met. "Old man, let Jiang Qiansong slow down," Li Tianlan said. His plan required perfect cooperation between him, Fireman, and Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud. Every minute and every second was extremely important to them. It was a race against time. "Leave it to me." Fireman's voice was steady and indifferent. Completely relieved, Li Tianlan rushed to Shankar again without hesitation. He didn't know if there was any connection between Shankar and Jiang Qiansong. But he could be sure of one thing. As the biggest ally of the Jiang family of South America and Eastern Europe, Jiang Qiansong could never watch Shankar be killed. Otherwise, the foundation of their cooperation would become meaningless. Li Tianlan had to kill Shankar, but he was not in a hurry. Now Shankar was like bait for Jiang Qiansong. Li Tianlan couldn't control Jiang Qiansong, but Shankar was close to him. He could control Shankar's whereabouts. He could control Jiang Qiansong's whereabouts, so the only thing he could do next was to cut off all possibilities of Shankar and Jiang Qiansong meeting. Without Jiang Qiansong, where could Shankar, who had no choice, go? He could only go back to the headquarters of the Rekvia family. Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud were already waiting there. Li Tianlan would chase Shankar into the headquarters of the Rekvia family. Jiang Qiansong would also chase Li Tianlan into the headquarters of the Rekvia family. However, Li Tianlan had prepared in advance. At that time, it was hard to say whether the headquarters of the Rekvia family belonged to Rekvia or Li Tianlan. Genius 1 second to remember this site address. Mobile version M. Chapter 423. If it weren't for his close relationship with the Samsara Palace, no one would have thought that the Samsara Palace would have such great power in Eastern Europe. In the dark world, the Samsara Palace could not be regarded as a super dark force. Although they had an invincible realm expert who ranked 4th on the divine list, a world-famous murderous weapon, and the 12 supermasters of the Samsara Palace, they had no foundation. But they had no foundation. A base that completely belonged to them represented the future and development potential of all forces. Not only the dark world, but also the whole world. Only when there was territory could there be a country. Only when there was a headquarters could there be a wealthy family. What kind of superforce was the Samsara Palace without foundation? Even if the power they showed was very strong, a force that seemed to have no future could only be a flash in the pan. The Samsara Palace seemed to have never paid attention to this problem, or they had never thought about the future. The biggest impression this force gave people was that it was mysterious. They seemed to be able to exert great influence anywhere, but they had no chance to reverse the general trend and make themselves the masters of a certain area. Eastern Europe used to be the territory of the Polar Ground Alliance. Zhengzhou State had the Wang family of Beihai and Kunlun City. In the final battle of Heaven Capital, the territory of East Island became the Purgatory of Heaven Capital. The European Union countries were the areas of the Shadow Throne and the Vatican. In the extremely chaotic Northern Europe, the Dark Knights and Knights Templars were fighting each other. America was even more lively. Fantasy World, Men in Black, the Jiang family of South America, and the Heroes Club were all there. Australia was also under the control of a few extremely powerful families. Even in Africa, there were guardian deities similar to Black Ghost. There seemed to be no place for the Samsara Palace in the whole dark world. They were like a force that quickly condensed into one after they suddenly appeared, wildly and wantonly blooming in the dark world. Then, under everyone's gaze, they unstoppably walked towards their doomsday. No one could have imagined that the Samsara Palace's arrangement in Eastern Europe would be so amazing. If Gandalf was not enough to explain anything, then everything that Fireman and the two sword masters had experienced during the 2 hours of following Jiang Qiansong was enough to show how terrifying the Samsara Palace's infiltration in Eastern Europe, at least in Wulan State. The whole Reki city was like a huge net, which directly enveloped Jiang Qiansong the moment he walked out of the airport. Neither Fireman nor the two sword masters thought that following Jiang Qiansong would be an easy task at first. Li Tianlan knew that he knew what kind of bargaining chips he had in his hands, but he didn't have time to explain them one by one. Therefore, in nearly 2 hours, Fireman and the two sword masters fully witnessed the infiltration of Samsara Palace in Wulan State. Gandalf has been in touch with them and watching everything behind the scenes. Their stalking seemed to have been arranged by someone. Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost's black Mercedes-Benz traveled on the road. Fireman followed him all the way. Tracking more than 1,500 meters, Fireman will definitely receive Gandalf's message for the first time. Then they overtook the car, changed cars in front of them, and chased after them after a few kilometers. During this period, the Samsara Palace had changed countless stalkers. If this was not the strangest thing, then the reaction of some troops really made Fireman feel a little incredible. Wulan State International Airport was far away from Reki City. The airport was located in the west of the city, about 60 kilometers from the city center, nearly 80 kilometers from Li Tianlan's current location in the east of the city, and about 100 kilometers from the headquarters of the Rekvia family. It was indeed a long way, but it was also impossible to walk for more than 2 hours. But every time Jiang Qiansong's vehicle was about to accelerate or take a shortcut, the soldiers of Wulan State who carried out the siege plan would appear intentionally or unintentionally. It was a simple interrogation and routine questioning. Time gradually passed in the repeated inquiries. While walking and stopping, Fireman's stalking seemed calmer. Gandalf's explanation for this was that the Samsara Palace had bribed some of the officers in Reki City. There seemed to be no problem with this explanation. But how powerful did the Samsara Palace have to be to put these officers who had been bribed by them on Jiang Qiansong's route? This was completely impossible. So the only explanation was that the Samsara Palace still kept a big fish in a really high position in Wulan State. At present, the insider, who was very likely to be in a high position in Wulan State, was still very implicit and low-key, and did not attract anyone's attention. But if all these forces burst out, they would be extremely terrifying. Even if they were not qualified to compete with Rekvia, at least they could not be ignored. With such a strong force, why didn't the Samsara Palace regard Wulan State as their base? Along the way, Fireman basically came over in his imagination. The tracking distance of nearly 100 kilometers, from beginning to end, Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost never found out that they were being followed. That was the most incredible thing. It was very easy, ridiculously easy. But it was not easy for 3 half-step Invincible Realm experts to follow 2 Invincible Realm experts. When the vehicle passed the city center, Gandalf reminded them again to change cars, and Li Tianlan's voice sounded directly from the communicator. His last order was very simple, but it was extremely cruel. Let Jiang Qiansong slow down. When he said this, the car had just passed the cold city center. The sirens from different corners in the distance whistled all the way east. A strong heartbeat sounded in Fireman's ears, with a sense of power. Fireman clenched the steering wheel and said calmly, "Leave it to me." Many years ago he said these 3 words to Li Honghe. A long time ago, he said these 3 words to Li Guangtu. Today he said these 3 words to Li Tianlan. "Leave it to me." The communication was cut off. Fireman's eyes gradually shone with light. Gear up. Accelerator. Speed up. The car, which looked very ordinary from the outside, suddenly burst into an amazing sound. The car went straight ahead. Fireman held the steering wheel. But the steering wheel had begun to catch fire. Black smoke came out of the cab. Han Chongyang and Yun Qinqi in the back row straightened their bodies at the same time. The car approached. In just a few seconds, Fireman's car was close to the Mercedes-Benz in which Jiang Qiansong was riding. The almost scrapped steering wheel suddenly turned in Fireman's hands. The tires rubbed against the ground. The fire rose to the sky in an instant. The burning car hit Jiang Qiansong's Mercedes-Benz with great ferocity. The huge impact caused the 2 cars to crash into the roadside guardrail at the same time. The guardrail was knocked to the other side of the road. The high temperature burned the car to the limit in its rotation and exploded. Fireman, who was completely condensed, punched the Mercedes-Benz in the explosion. Only one simple yet powerful word rang out in the midst of the explosion. Go. The flames were surging. The sword light rose to the sky. It was close to noon. Nearly 7 hours had passed since Li Tianlan's surprise attack on Jiang Qianyan. In the east of Reki City in the heavy rain, the raging fire and sword light from Zhongzhou State rushed to the supreme ruler of the Jiang family of South America without hesitation. Whether from the back or the front, the great change in Reki City was seen as the starting point of the official outbreak of the chaos in Eastern Europe. The collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance. The destruction of the Samsara Palace. The turmoil in Eastern Europe. Under the prospect of huge benefits, the whole dark world went crazy. A turbulent and crazy era often meant the death of the old era, and the beginning of the new era. When the news of Jiang Qianyan's death spread throughout the dark world, everyone knew what it meant. The collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance and the Samsara Palace caused chaos in Eastern Europe. And Jiang Qianyan, in a strict sense, could be said to be the first Invincible Realm expert to die in the chaos in Eastern Europe. No one was mentally prepared for a storm in Eastern Europe, which was full of ups and downs. Some people were still waiting to see which way the wind was blowing, but some people were already on their way. Snow Country was the largest country in the world, and its borders almost ran through all of Eastern Europe. From different places in Snow Country to Wulan State, the distance was naturally different. The Vatican and Knights Templars were stationed in the middle of Snow Country. The distance from where they were stationed to Reki City was neither far nor near. The helicopter roared in the air. The cities, forests, and rivers below Snow Country receded one by one. The helicopter flew very high. Chaos, the chief of Knights Templars and an Invincible Realm expert, sat in the cabin and looked gloomily at the vague scenery below. He had been silent for a long time. Holy Virgin Angel of the Vatican sat opposite Chaos, and also looked at him for a long time. This kind of military helicopter, codenamed Skybird by the Snow Country military, was very fast, but the cabin was not big. Therefore, there were not many people from the Vatican on this trip to Reki City. More people had to watch the follow-up situation before deciding whether to go to Wulan State. So in the small cabin, Holy Virgin Angel, Mellad, the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps, Chaos, the chief of Knights Templars, 5 saint warriors, and 2 holy punishment priests were all the people from the Vatican who were rushing to Recce City this time. The 10 people were silent at the same time in the roar of the rotors. It seemed that everyone had their own thoughts. Melad, the second commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps, codenamed Disciple, observed all this with interest. The light in his eyes was vague and playful. Nearly a third of the journey had passed. It was expected that the helicopter would arrive in Recce City before 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Chaos's face was still gloomy and livid, and he was silent without saying a word. Your Excellency, Chief of Knights. Angel, who had also been silent all the way, frowned slightly. Under the white veil, her voice was cold and indifferent. I still don't see your sincerity. Without sincerity, it's meaningless for you to get on the plane with us. Sincerity? Chaos suddenly laughed. In everyone's eyes, Knights Templars was a branch of the Vatican. In fact, it was the same. However, as an invincible realm expert, Chaos's status was even higher than that of the Chief Knight of Knights Templars. In the Vatican, Chaos was definitely a big shot. The commander of the Holy Disarmament Corps, the second commander, the cardinals, the Holy Virgin, and even the Pope would give him enough respect. This was the treatment that an invincible realm expert deserved. Therefore, even in the face of the Holy Virgin of the Vatican, Chaos's tone was still direct and almost presumptuous. Your Highness, tell me, what should I do to show my sincerity? We are still hundreds of kilometers away from Recce City. Do you want me to kneel in the cabin and start to repent now? You still don't understand. Angel looked at Chaos and said in a flat tone. I don't understand. Chaos stood up. He was very tall. When he stood up, his head almost reached the ceiling. He stood in front of Angel with a full aura and pressure. I don't understand how you persuaded His Majesty the Pope. His Majesty actually asked me, the Chief Knight of Chaos, to apologize to a young man and to Zhongzhou State? In the Dark World, Knights Templars has never been afraid of anyone, let alone apologize to anyone. There was a fierce light in his eyes. He stared at Angel and said, not even once. Angel was silent as she faced the growing sense of oppression from Chaos. She was silent for a long time. Then she said calmly, in fact, Your Excellency, I didn't persuade His Majesty. Knights Templars must get the understanding of Zhongzhou State. In the case that Knights Templars did not participate in the massacre of the Zhongzhou State garrison, we need to live in peace with Zhongzhou State for the time being. In order to achieve this goal, this time Knights Templars needs to pay more than an apology. Of course, from the standpoint of the Vatican, we hope that you only need to apologize in exchange for peace. Peace? Chaos sneered, and his eyes were unusually cold. I'm not convinced. But this is His Majesty's will. Angel stared at Chaos, and her voice gradually became dignified. Your Excellency, either respect the will of His Majesty, or give up your faith. There will be another name on the list of heresies of the Vatican. I will respect the will of His Majesty the Pope. Chaos narrowed his eyes. But I hope that after I do all this, I can get a reasonable explanation. That's why you still don't understand. Angel said coldly. You apologize to Zhongzhou State. In the final analysis, you apologize to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan may not seem important to you, but in the chaos of Eastern Europe, he is very important. Samsara Palace, Sai City, Mount Shu, Jade Pool, and even the Wang family of Beihai, Kunlun City, and the Jiang family of South America are all involved with him. In the final battle of Heaven Capital 3 years ago, the Heroes Club, Fantasy World, your Knights Templars, the Polar Ground Alliance, and even the Vatican all had karma with him. Your Excellency, with all due respect, if you really want to find a few key figures who can influence the overall situation in the chaos in Eastern Europe, it's obvious that you, an invincible realm expert, are not one of them. You don't know what chips he has now, but you should know that he attacked the Jiang family of South America on the first day he entered Eastern Europe. Now all the powers in the world have begun to put pressure on Zhongzhou State. But if Li Tianlan survives this, you should know what he will get. Angel said calmly. Or what does Li Tianlan want now? What? Hun Dun frowned and asked subconsciously. The chaos in Eastern Europe was too chaotic. It was so chaotic that except for himself, everyone else was an enemy. It was difficult for Hun Dun to focus all his attention on one place. He had to pay attention to Eastern Europe. Perhaps, as Angel said, until now, Hun Dun had not even figured out who the key figure in the chaos in Eastern Europe was. Angel glanced at Hun Dun. She felt that the other party's subconscious rhetorical question was really stupid. Reki City was so chaotic that several countries listed Zhongzhou State as hostile. Nearly 20 powers suppressed Zhongzhou State, hoping that Zhongzhou State would compromise. Zhongzhou State was still silent. But where did Li Tianlan go? If he wanted to stay in Zhongzhou State and maintain his current status and the Li family's right to survive, he had to reverse all this. How to reverse it? If Li Tianlan succeeded, the Jiang family of South America was destined to be out of the Eastern European chaos in advance and become the first superpower to exit early in the chaos. If Li Tianlan succeeded, the Rekvia family was bound to fall into Li Tianlan's hands. If Li Tianlan succeeded, he would control Rekvia and force the Jiang family of South America to retreat. With Wulan State as the center, the sphere of influence of the Rekvia family would be Li Tianlan's sphere of influence. At that time, the Arctic Ocean Command of Zhongzhou State would definitely expand again and settle in Wulan State. At that time, because the Arctic Ocean Command had made up for the vacancy in Wulan State in Eastern Europe, it would have the strength to deter the whole of Eastern Europe and even retain the aggressiveness against Western Europe. If Li Tianlan succeeded, all this belonged to him, the Li family and Zhongzhou State. Whether it was vested interests or strategic prospects, they were extremely wonderful. It was precisely because Zhongzhou State saw this that it kept silent and waited for Li Tianlan's result in Reki City. Li Tianlan had the support of Samsara Palace. He held too many chips in his hand. At the very least, he had the sword that was destined to shock the world behind him. The Vatican could not see the possibility of his failure. If Li Tianlan had determined his position in Wulan State, and the Jiang family of South America had withdrawn, his next target would definitely be Knights Templars, and the Vatican behind Knights Templars. The Vatican was not afraid of Li Tianlan, nor of Zhongzhou State. But now the Vatican needed the sword of Samsara Palace. This was the real top priority. So they needed Knights Templars to reach an agreement with Li Tianlan, even if they had to pay more than an apology. This or something else, at some important moments, even including the cultivation and life of chaos, an invincible realm expert. This matter was extremely important. In the Vatican's plan, this was even one of the most important things. But this matter was also very complicated. Angel thought about it and tried to say as simply as possible. Simply put, if Li Tianlan succeeds, he will get Wulan State as the core, the military power of the 5 nearby countries. With Wulan State as the core, the military power of the 5 nearby countries. Although the countries around Wulan State were very small. But in terms of land area, Wulan State was the second largest country in Europe except for Snow Country. Once this plan succeeded, it could even affect the transfer of the entire Arctic Ocean Command of Zhongzhou State. At that time, the army of Zhongzhou State occupied Wulan State. Chaos's face became more and more ugly. But Angel was not finished yet. From a certain secret cooperation, our obligation this time may not only be to apologize, but also to help Li Tianlan get the military power of the 5 countries. What about us? Chaos sneered and said, what can we get? His Majesty the Pope's will is that Li Tianlan can get the military power, but the Vatican must get the divine power. Angel said. The Vatican was on the way. The Shadow Throne was also on the way. When many people were paying attention to Jiang Qiansong, only the Shadow Throne was paying attention to Black Ghost, who was known as the guardian deity of Africa. Like the Polar Ground Alliance, the Shadow Throne was also an extremely strange superpower. There were similarities between the two, but they were not exactly the same. The leader of the Polar Ground Alliance was supported by the 4 major families in Eastern Europe, and then established by the support of the major families in Eastern Europe. However, there was only one surname on the throne of the Shadow Throne for hundreds of years. That was Rothschild, a super ancient wealthy family with a longer history than the Wang family of Beihai. The Shadow Throne was also composed of the major families in Europe, but at the same time, It was the guardian of the European Union. The meaning of this position was extremely broad. It meant that it was absolutely fair and neutral within the European Union, but it also had countless invisible power and glory. The Shadow Throne guarded the entire European Union. The status of the wealthy families under the throne was naturally stable within the European Union. This close relationship of mutual cooperation and interdependence was far more mature than that of the Polar Ground Alliance. If the Polar Ground Alliance continued to develop, it might also become an organization like the Shadow Throne. At that time, there would be two superpowers in Europe, one occupying Eastern Europe and the other occupying Western Europe. It would be a magnificent scene. However, within the Polar Ground Alliance, where even the leader did not have much dominance, the game between the leader and the four major families, and the entanglement between the major families in various countries, made all of this extremely complicated. The Polar Ground Alliance could only become more and more bloated and chaotic, and eventually collapse completely. The Shadow Throne came to Eastern Europe from Western Europe this time, and had basically secretly obtained the consent of the majority of the European Union countries. Almost all countries in Western Europe hoped to completely turn Europe into the world of the Shadow Throne. This was destined to spur the formation of an unprecedented behemoth in the Dark World. However, such a behemoth meant stability in the political system of Western Europe, which was far more mature than that of Eastern Europe. However, in the Shadow Throne, although Rothschild had enough dominance, Grand Duke Irene Qingtong Wang Rothschild, known as the Shadow Queen, also needed to make a choice between the interests of the major countries and the interests of the major wealthy families. The major countries of the European Union hoped that the Queen of Shadows could let the shadow cover Eastern Europe. This was destined to be a long, complicated, and tortuous process. However, the major families in the Shadow Throne unanimously asked the Queen to kill the Black Ghost in Africa. This process might be short, but it would not be easy. A few years ago, the Black Ghost suddenly appeared in Africa. In a very short time, the major families in the Shadow Throne suffered heavy losses in the hands of the Black Ghost. Africa was very down and out, but it was not barren. It was a land full of gold. The major families suffered heavy losses in Africa, and the benefits they represented were simply unimaginable. However, the Black Ghost had a very deep foundation in Africa. He was known as the guardian deity, and he had won the support of dozens of indigenous tribes in Africa. He had a great momentum, and there was a vague intention to compete with the African Divine Martial Army. Everyone knew that the Divine Martial Army's backer was the Wang family of Beihai, but no one knew if the Black Ghost also knew it. However, the Black Ghost had never had too much friction with the Divine Martial Army. What he wanted seemed to be benefits. So the wealthy families in the Shadow Throne were plundered by him one by one. In the past few years, the two sides had fought countless times, and the hatred had become deeper and deeper. It had gradually become an inextricable knot. In particular, in the past 2 years, the two sides had fought with each other for real. Black Ghost was constantly growing, but the benefits of the major families in the Shadow Throne in some parts of Africa were close to zero. Capitalists hated others to touch their cake the most. What's more, it was such a big cake like Africa. Now the Black Ghost appeared in Eastern Europe. Many wealthy families in the Shadow Throne had decided to kill the Black Ghost in Eastern Europe. As for the Jiang family of South America, they were opponents anyway. If they could kill him, it would be good. Qingtong also thought it was good. So as soon as she knew that the Black Ghost appeared, she had already set off for Reki City. Reki City seemed to have become the focus of Eastern Europe overnight. For Qingtong, the Black Ghost was there and he had to die. And in the current situation, the Snowdance Corps and the Jiang family of South America were fighting endlessly in Reki City, and the Rekvia family and Wulon State were likely to change their positions at any time. Their positions might be the same as those of the Jiang family of South America, but if Li Tianlan won, they would also surrender to Li Tianlan helplessly. Such a swing also meant that if the Shadow Throne finally established the situation in Reki City, Rekvia and Wulon State would maintain the same position as the Shadow Throne. This was the helplessness after the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance. Morton, Violet, the Qin family and Rekvia. The 4 major families in Eastern Europe supported the Polar Ground Alliance. The first 3 were better, but Rekvia was recognized as the weakest of the 4 major families. In the case that they did not support Tyrant, the Polar Ground Alliance collapsed. At the critical moment, Tyrant could not support them. This was an opportunity for everyone. Rekvia. The helicopter was flying fast in the air. The golden pupils of the Queen of Shadows gradually lit up, becoming more and more enchanting. She suddenly felt that it was indeed a good choice to put the breakthrough in Eastern Europe in Rekvia. No, it was even the best choice. Was it because Li Tianlan saw this that he chose to attack the Jiang family of South America and involve Rekvia and Wulan state at the same time? If there was a plan in advance, then he could certainly predict the current situation now. How could he not be prepared for the current situation? King Tong frowned. Thinking of this problem, she suddenly felt a little uneasy, but she also had some fighting spirit. The chaos in all of Eastern Europe seemed to be getting more and more interesting. Let's speed up. Standing on the helicopter, King Tong suddenly ordered. The helicopter gradually accelerated in the air. Through the cabin, King Tong looked into the distance. The Shadow Throne was different from any other force. They entered Eastern Europe, but for the time being, they did not choose to join forces with any major force in Eastern Europe. The allies they had identified in private were outside Eastern Europe, but they were very close to Eastern Europe. The Wang family of Beihai. This also meant that the Shadow Throne's next action might become the enemy of all the forces in Eastern Europe. It also meant that the Shadow Throne had the possibility of becoming an ally of any force in Eastern Europe. King Tong vaguely sensed a series of variables that were about to form in Eastern Europe after the dust settled in Wulan state. Her golden pupils grew deeper and more enchanting. A storm was brewing in Eastern Europe. What was an enemy or a friend? Genius 1 second to remember the address of this website. Mobile version M. Chapter 424. The fire burned the curtain of rain. At the moment when the black Mercedes-Benz collided and exploded, Fireman's burning fist almost covered most of the street. Flowing fire. Violent fire. The heavy rain did not evaporate in the fire. Under the sky, water and fire seemed to be completely connected. So the fire was no longer burning, but turned into a magma-like liquid. The surging waves directly covered with unimaginable heat and high temperature. The sword light surged into the wind in the magma. Light and darkness were yin and yang. Ice and fire were also yin and yang. On the street of Reki City, the moment Fireman and the 2 sword masters attacked, the distance between the 3 of them was so close. Vaguely, the power and sword intent between the 3 seemed to have completely condensed together. In Zhongzhou state, this was a relatively common sword formation. Countless ordinary soldiers and ordinary special warfare personnel could use the sword formation. It was not exquisite and belonged to a very basic sword formation, the 3 elements formation. But at this moment, this was a sword formation composed of 3 superiors of the half-step invincible realm. The surging magma suddenly covered the whole street. The magma burned everything, but it solidified the moment it flowed. Only the sword intent traveled through the solidified sea of fire. Wherever the sword intent passed, ice and snow began to appear in the sea of fire. Under the fusion of the piercing cold and boiling heat, the whole world seemed to become extremely fragile, and a large area of space began to shatter in the 2 very different temperatures. The 3 elements formation changed quietly. Han Chongyang, the yin and yang sword master, directly replaced Fireman's position and stabbed straight with his sword. Yin and yang sword, yin and yang impermanence. The solidified fire and the frozen ice all burst with this sword. The whole street was almost completely occupied by the surging sword energy in the blink of an eye. The raging fire, ice, wind, and snow kept colliding and exploding in the completely torn space, and the huge force completely smashed the overturned Mercedes-Benz. The yin and yang sword intent did not dissipate, but became more and more powerful. The 2 sword intents reincarnated repeatedly, as if they would never stop. Han Chongyang stood in the front. Fireman and Yin Qinshi stood on the left and right. As Han Chongyang stabbed forward with his sword, the 3 moved forward at the same time. The surging ice and fire were completely compressed as the yin and yang sword moved forward. The three of them were no more than 20 meters away from the overturned Mercedes-Benz. In the blink of an eye, the tip of the yin-yang sword had already pierced in the direction where Benz had originally been. There was no surging ice and fire, no circulating sword intent, only a void. This empty space was so out of place with its surroundings, so it naturally became the target of all the sword chi, ice, and fire attacks. The sharp edge of the yin-yang sword stabbed into the dark and calm hollow, as if it had stabbed into the real object of the sword shadow. Han Chongyang's arm muscles trembled. In the three talents formation, the strength of the three overlapped. The power of this sword was far beyond Han Chongyang's peak state. The yin-yang sword that had been passed down in Mount Shu for hundreds of years seemed to be unable to bear the power of this sword. The slender sword edge began to bend slightly in the trembling. The hole that was being stared at by the sword began to glow, and the blurry space began to become round, looking like a transparent ball. The sphere began to expand under the pressure of the sword tip. The edge of the yin-yang sword began to bend. Han Chongyang's face suddenly changed. As he took a step back, Fireman took his place at the same time with great tacit understanding and punched it directly with all his strength. This punch did not bring any raging fire, but the wind of the fist seemed to collapse the space along the way. In the terrible roaring sound of the wind and thunder, Fireman's fist turned fiery red. Boom! The clenched fist slammed into the expanding transparent ball. Half of the street seemed to shake with a rumble. The dark and round sphere was no longer expanding, but the inside shone with a dazzling light. The pure light swelled in the round sphere, and two figures slowly came out of the endless light. Jiang Qiansong, Black Ghost, Fireman, and the two sword masters both recognized the two targets. At the same time, they also recognized this unique skill. This was the unique skill that Jiang Qianyan had just used not long ago. 30-meter Mortal World Radiant Temple. The three figures moved at the same time. In the center of the light, Jiang Qiansong had raised his hand casually. The space shook fiercely for a moment. The light and the spherical domain around him expanded at the same time, enveloping Fireman and the two sword masters. The next second, the whole domain began to shrink with endless light. The three figures were first unbalanced in the shrinking domain, and then out of control. Involuntarily, Jiang Qiansong rushed over. Black Ghost grinned and pulled out a jet-black short knife. At the moment when the 30-meter Mortal World domain shrank, Black Ghost waved the short knife in his hand directly. A piece of black and sharp knife light appeared directly in the domain of the 30-meter Mortal World, which was so dazzling in the pure light. This was pure power and killing intent, with unparalleled savagery and madness. The knife light flashed and passed through Fireman's body. Then it was Han Chongyang and Yin Qinshi. The bodies of the three turned into pieces the moment they touched the knife light. Black Ghost froze for a moment. Jiang Qiansong frowned slightly, and opened his palm subconsciously. The light faded around him, and the domain disappeared. The figures of Fireman and the two sword masters reappeared in the sight of the two invincible realm experts. From beginning to end, the three of them had never been pulled into the domain of the 30-meter Mortal World. Everything just now was just an illusion. Phantom sword? Yin-yang sword? Jiang Qiansong raised his eyebrows. He said the sword of Mount Shu, but his sharp eyes were fixed on Fireman. The corners of his mouth twitched. In a trance, he seemed to feel the unforgettable smell from many years ago. Jiang Qiansong's palms clenched into fists. But in terms of scheming, the dominator of the Jiang family of South America was indeed far better than Jiang Qianyan. Even when he remembered the humiliation he had received, his tone was still calm. You killed Qianyan? Fireman didn't speak, just reached out and rubbed his crotch. This action carried an obvious hint. After all, both Jiang Qianyan and Jiang Qiansong had said that Uncle Fire's urine was delicious. Jiang Qiansong's eyes suddenly twisted for a moment, and became extremely ferocious. He took a deep breath, slowly turned around and said to Black Ghost, "Kill them." Before he finished speaking, a jet-black saber light had already flashed through the world in the curtain of rain. Black Ghost drew his knife and rushed forward. In an instant, his figure was infinitely close to Fireman and the two sword masters. The invincible black ghost, who had never been on the divine and holy lists, but had given the shadow throne a headache in Africa, showed his full edge for the first time in Eastern Europe. Fast. The unparalleled rapidity made Black Ghost sprint with an extremely wild impact and penetrating power. The black knife in his hand was waved 100 meters away. Before the knife reached its apex, he had rushed out nearly 100 meters. The black knife and the black man. With one step, he directly tore a dark tide of nearly 100 meters in the street. The sword light of the yin-yang sword and the phantom sword completely overlapped. The raging fire in Fireman's hands continued to gather. The fire condensed together and turned into magma. The magma slowly solidified and turned into a wall of fire standing between the three of them. The yin and yang sword intent and the phantom sword intent were superimposed at the same time. The ice began to gather inside the wall of fire, and the phantom sword intent enveloped the wall of fire. For a time, there were several walls of fire that were hard to distinguish between real and fake on the street. Black Ghost had rushed over. Phantom ice raging fire? He didn't care at all. One knife. The black knife cut through the air with a whistling sound like a hurricane. 100-meter-long knife light directly slashed on the phantom wall of fire. Under the heavy rain, the flowing fire suddenly flew up with the sword energy. The wall of fire was completely smashed under the knife, and the sword intent collapsed in the air. Fireman Han Chongyang and Yin Qinshi were sent flying by this knife at the same time. Black Ghost's body stagnated for a moment, and a paleness flashed across his dark face. He withdrew his knife and rushed forward. His whole body's essence, chi, and spirit were completely locked on Fireman in an instant. His figure rushed over directly with the darkness, and he punched Fireman's head hard. Fireman, whose eyes were solemn and focused, raised his head. The raging fire suddenly rose as he raised his head. Black Ghost punched. Fireman was also punching. The boundless fire condensed into a huge flame fist shadow in the darkness around Black Ghost. Black Ghost rushed down with a roar and punched the flame fist shadow with the dark domain. The huge fist shadow collapsed completely, and the two men's arms collided fiercely. Kacha! With a crisp sound, Fireman spat out a mouthful of blood directly. With his broken arm, he was instantly blown away by this punch. Black Ghost also spat out a mouthful of blood, but his eyes became wilder. Fireman, who was blown away, was supported by Han Chongyang. The severe pain of his broken arm made the muscles on his face twitch. His breath began to weaken, and he looked down at his broken arm. There were no words to describe his emotions and eyes at this moment. If he could be 10 years younger. No, 5 years. Even if he could go back to the time when Li Tianlan first went to the desert prison more than 3 years ago, Fireman was sure to kill Black Ghost. He had a future that was countless times more brilliant than it was now. He had the safest road to the invincible realm. And he had the talent of martial arts that amazed the whole Zhongzhou state. But now all of this was ruined. It was ruined in time, in the prison, and in the turbulent and insidious power game. Fireman's body trembled slightly, and he struggled to move forward again. Elder Hua. Han Chongyang pulled him and said, "Let me do it. The other party is not as strong as he looks." Fireman whispered, "His defense is very poor." Black Ghost was indeed in the invincible realm, but his invincible realm was extremely special. To some extent, the Jiang family of South America did not cultivate experts in the invincible realm, but invincible realm weapons that could cooperate with the Jiang family of South America. Black Ghost's attack power was undoubtedly at the level of the divine list. But his defense was not even as good as that of the ordinary half-step invincible realm, which was his most fatal flaw. If he could be 2 years younger, or any top half-step invincible realm expert was here, such as Li Tianlan, then the possibility of killing Black Ghost was absolutely there. "Let me do it." Fireman took a deep breath and broke free from Han Chongyang's hand. His eyes were like two wildfires that refused to be extinguished, determined and crazy. "I'll leave the rest to you." This sentence was not only for Han Chongyang and Yin Qinshi. It was also for Li Tianlan, Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud. "No need." Li Tianlan's calm voice suddenly sounded in the communication channel. Fireman froze for a moment. Boom. A violent explosion suddenly sounded on the street. Da-da-da, bang. Who? All kinds of chaotic sounds kept ringing after the explosion. It was not only Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost. Even the faces of Fireman and the two sword masters changed dramatically. There was a sharp whistling sound and a suspenseful turning sound in the air. The sound of the tracks rubbing against the ground approached quickly, along with messy footsteps and clear and powerful orders. Jiang Qiansong, Black Ghost, Fireman, Yin Qinshi, Han Chongyang. The same picture appeared in everyone's eyes. The dense army, the advancing main battle tanks, the soaring fighter planes, and the hovering helicopters. For a time, a torrent of firepower blanketed the entire block. Bullets, cannonballs, rocket launchers. The whole block turned into ruins in just a few seconds, but the dense firepower was still pouring out wantonly, regardless of the enemy or friend. Or from the standpoint of Wulon State, whether it was Fireman or Jiang Qiansong, they were all enemies. The explosions that were enough to destroy everything kept ringing. The dense firepower covered every inch of land. Large tracts of buildings slowly fell down, and black smoke rose. In the smoke and dust all over the sky, everyone's sight was filled with destructive artillery fire. The artillery fire was endless. It fell resolutely and fiercely more and more. Experts could indeed resist the impact of a lot of modern artillery fire. But being able to resist a lot was not the same concept as resisting all of them. The invincible realm was also a body of flesh and blood. Not to mention missiles and machine guns. Even if thousands of people kept shooting with the least powerful pistols, the invincible realm experts would not be able to bear it after a long time. In the almost earth-shattering firepower, the domain of the invincible realm, the sword intent of Mount Shu, and the raging fire of Fireman were all madly consuming. Fireman took the two sword masters to stop the two invincible realm experts of the Jiang family of South America. This was an almost impossible task, especially the two invincible realm experts whose shortcomings could completely complement each other. One of the most important prerequisites for the three of them to carry out this task was the cooperation of the Samsara Palace's forces in Eastern Europe. Fireman was almost sure that the Samsara Palace had raised a big fish in the military of Wulon State, an absolutely powerful big fish. Now, with a flick of the big fish's tail, the sky was filled with artillery fire that covered the entire street, regardless of friend or foe. Was this the so-called fucking cooperation? Fireman cursed in a low voice. Old man, don't talk nonsense, retreat quickly. Li Tianlan said in a hurry. This kind of indiscriminate attack was indeed cruel, but it was the only way. The battlefield full of artillery fire could indeed pose a fatal threat to Fireman and the others. But such a threat seemed so insignificant compared to the threat brought to them by Jiang Qiansong and Black Ghost. In contrast, such a degree of artillery fire coverage was completely equivalent to providing the perfect cover for Fireman and the others. You three, turn left at the second intersection ahead, and someone will pick you up to leave the battlefield. Gandalf's voice suddenly sounded with a deep smile. As for this block, it is destined to be covered by artillery fire for a long time. Fireman's heart skipped a beat. He turned around and ran forward. As long as someone picked them up to leave here. The intensive artillery fire was equivalent to Li Tianlan giving Jiang Qiansong a choice. A choice without a choice. He could not choose to stand here under the artillery fire of Reki City and eventually die here. He could only choose to break through. To break through he had to kill. Kill the people of Reki City. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.